Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Heathcliff and I was born and raised in London, England, in the highly esteemed Knightsbridge area, which is a very affluent, wealthy part of London. I was raised with the quintessential advantages that wealth and privilege bring to the table, and I was very fortunate and privileged to attend some of England's finest schools while acquiring my law degrees at Oxford University. My demure father is a true Londoner, but my mother is from the Big Apple, so I am half American. My soft-spoken parents are both incredibly reserved, introverted and self-contained and very private people who find it exceedingly difficult to express their emotions. And although growing up I knew that they loved me based on their actions, these feelings were never articulated into words. As a result, I grew up to become equally as inhibited socially, somewhat self-effacing and rigidly reserved like many of my parents. Some people consider that snobbish, but I assure you it's not the case. I would describe myself as a self-reliant, independent person who has chosen by choice never to marry or to have children, which may change one day when I become a lonely, embittered old man. And by the way, that's meant as a joke. All these years I have been nursing a deep, dark secret that no one in my immediate circle of friends is privy to knowing, nor is it something I would be desirous to share with anyone, not even like-minded people like myself. That is how extremely private I am. I have developed a secret passion for the mysterious critter often referred to as Bigfoot, Sasquatch or Yeti. So intense and extreme was my inquisitiveness in regard to this matter that I spent hours of my time researching the subject in secret. You could say it was my own shameful, adulterous affair. Was it really possible that a huge humanoid critter like this could indeed be roaming the forests of North America and Canada? And some say there have even been sightings here in England. But few are willing to share their incredulous stories because the ridicule and disbelief would be great, and the scoffers many. I am one of those people that has never trusted the news media, nor have I ever taken anything at face value, because there are too many people out there with their partisan, biased agendas hoping to influence us one way or another into their way of thinking. So I pride myself on seeking after the truth and not being influenced by the opinions of others. For me, an erroneous large footprint in the sand does not necessarily mean that it was made by a Bigfoot, nor a strange roar in the night, for indeed it can be attributed to absolutely anything. I'm possibly the greatest skeptic of them all, but I'm the kind of cynic that is only too happy to be proved wrong, especially in regards to the matter of Bigfoot, because I want to believe that he exists. It would make our planet one hell of a more interesting place, if indeed he did. Did you know that as far as the International Tourism Board is concerned, about 95% of America is completely unexplored or underexplored, as so many of the country is off the beaten path? The largest areas of wilderness in America is actually in Alaska. Then there's Canada, Idaho, Nevada, California, Washington, Florida, Montana, and the list goes on. And I'm only talking about the American continent, so one can only begin to wonder what is out there in this unexplored wilderness areas of our globe. So with a hankering to find out answers in regards to the Bigfoot phenomenon, I chartered a small plane on several different occasions and was dropped in a variety of remote, isolated and unexplored locations of North American wilderness not frequented by humans that was usually so rugged it was almost physically impossible for the plane to land safely. It would seem that on all those occasions where I spent camping and hiking in the wilderness terrain, I yield no fruitful results as far as an interaction with Bigfoot was concerned, although I did encounter bobcats, cougars, grizzlies, and the list goes on. But that's a whole nother story. Naturally, it left me feeling bitterly disappointed and wondering whether Bigfoot really was just a mythical critter of legend brought to life by many well-meaning people who wanted to believe that Bigfoot was real. Then one day my luck changed quite considerably. My plane was able to drop me in an open clearing, and I made swift arrangements to be picked up in the same spot the following week. As per usual, I was exceedingly hopeful that this camping expedition would be different to all the others, and that somehow I would encounter some evidence of Bigfoot activity, for I am always mindful to be sceptically optimistic. So there I was in the heart of the American wilderness, but I want to keep this particular location strictly private for obvious and personal reasons. At this particular juncture, I was surrounded by rugged outcrops, sheer cliff faces, treacherous mountainous terrain, unique and exquisite rock formations, secluded beautiful lakes, and very thick dense forest, and I honestly had no idea what to expect, but I knew that I was in an area that could potentially be exceedingly dangerous with wild animals loitering around, like bobcats, cougars, mountain lions and bears, all which I have had to encounter before. So armed with my backpack, a rifle and a machete, I cut my way through the laborious thick vegetation, but before long I didn't need to use my machete at all. I was exceedingly fortunate to come across wooded areas with large, wide open trails, lots of deer scat, along with silvery lakes and streams, which is exactly what I was looking for, because I was always searching for food and water sources, which are the prerequisites for survival. I tried to look at a location through the eyes of the critter, and I asked myself, if I was Bigfoot, would I be comfortable living here? When it comes to searching for Bigfoot, I was not planning to go exploring, trekking or hiking for many long miles. The whole idea was to camp somewhere for many days, in the hope that I could get the Bigfoot to come to me, not the other way round. I believe that that is a classic, quite profound mistake commonly made by many people. If these critters are indeed real, and they possess human-like characteristics, then they're almost certainly as curious and inquisitive about us as much as we are about them. I hoped that my presence in the area would be alluring enough to attract the curiosity of Bigfoot, if they did in fact exist. As I ventured through this exquisite wooded area, it wasn't unlike many of the more regularly frequented forests many people visit every year in North America. It was exceedingly beautiful indeed, but with huge mature trees that were clearly hundreds of years old, that towered into the sky like majestic, imposing skyscrapers. Many of them were quite literally swathed in carpets of the most resplendent, verdant, rich moss that hung from the tree in delicate green sheaths. The curvaceous tree branches crisscrossed each other from a great height, providing a glorious umbrellaed canopy above my head, where prisms of light twinkled through the branches, dappling the floor in a very pretty ethereal luminescence. I trekked slowly through this magnificent evergreen oasis, my feet crunching the carpets of ferns and rambling pretty ground covers beneath me, some of which I noted possessed pink, purple or yellow pretty flowers. The forest was alive with birdsong, and I discerned that squirrels and chipmunks stared at me with an intense curiosity, for I was possibly the first human being that they'd ever encountered in their lives. Some squirrels, so intrigued by me, darted from one tree to another, following me through the wooded terrain, as their interest in me was heightened. Before long I found a picturesque clearing on a sandy beach, overlooking an exquisite silvery lake, flanked by trees and dotted with smooth sculptural rocks that were masterful works of art in their own right. Yes, I thought to myself, if I was Bigfoot, I would most definitely live here, or at least visit this lake for an evening dip. I knew in my gut that this was the place where I would camp out for a week, and so I prepared an exceedingly large fire pit and collected a sizable amount of firewood to keep it going throughout the night. The idea of this is to ward off predators, but also to ensure any possible Bigfoots might be able to see me clearly in the light of the flames, if indeed such a critter did exist here in North America. This was not something I needed to broadcast to the world, for I am not interested in notoriety of any kind, but it is something I personally needed to do to satisfy my innermost curiosity and insatiable quest for answers in regard to this intriguing matter that weighed heavily on my shoulders and tugged at my heartstrings. Once I hitched my tent, I boiled some water to prepare one of my very palatable meals, which on this occasion was curry and rice, which was washed down with a very delicious sizable hot mug of tea. If you know anything at all about the English, the quintessential cup of tea is a very significant part of our lives, for indeed our days revolve around this hot beverage, of which I would never be without. As the day began to wind down, and a bedazzling, beguiling golden sunset began to set over the valley in exquisite folds of golds, tangerines, and pinks, I began to experience the very evident feeling that I was being watched, which was exceedingly good news. In truth, it did send a huge tingling chill down my spine and cause the hair on the back of my neck to stand up on edge. Was I being stalked by a predator like a mountain lion or cougar, or had I already aroused attention from the very species I was eager to draw into my web, with the subtlety of a spider dragging in an unsuspecting fly into her silken fibres? My heart was beating furiously and flapping fast as a mixture of excitement and dread overwhelmed my being. But the feeling of being watched subsided very quickly, and then with the efficiency of a light switch being clicked on and off, the golden sunset dissipated as the night was finally born. Pretty soon I was staring up at a dark sky, dotted with a kaleidoscope of twinkling stars, and I was graced with the spectacular fullness of the golden moon. I stared at the flickering flames of my fire as it crackled and burnt the dry wood, and I listened to the comforting, reassuring sounds of the crickets and the frogs, and the distant calls of coyotes, and then I retired to the warmth and coziness of my sleeping bag for a much-needed good night's sleep. I was suddenly awoken in the middle of the night to a very clear bipedal pair of footsteps walking around my campsite, crunching the beach-like pebbles beneath heavy feet, in close proximity to my tent, rather too close for comfort, I might add. Sometimes the feet would stop and pause, and then I would hear the walking continuing over again. In that moment I was absolutely terrified, and I discerned what I can only describe as a deep breathing. If that wasn't horrifying enough for you, something or someone was touching the roof area of my tent, for I could indeed see the fibre being pushed inwards, and the deep impression of a very sizable fist-like imprint on the canvas. My tent was 8 feet off the ground, so whatever this was, it had to be humanoid, unless it was a bear straddled on 2 legs, but the noises these critters were making were not the sounds of bears. All of a sudden I heard a low, excitable talking, almost as if someone was deliberately whispering in a low voice in order not to be heard, but I could detect very distinct syllables and a very defined conversational language being spoken in words that were too fast to discern, like 3 people having an argument over something. It would not have been out of place hearing this brawl in any big city. You would assume someone was caught up in a slight disagreement or spat. I crept ever closer towards my tent, and as quietly as I could, I unzipped the zipper and peered out of the opening. My heart was beating thunderously at this point, so much so that I could feel the vibrational thuds in my chest and actually hear the distinct audible beats. And even my fingers were trembling, and my mind was whirling and spinning like a washing machine on full cycle, for my thoughts were scattered all over the place. All I could think was, what the heck is going on out there? That was when I saw 3 giant-like humans, 2 with their backs facing away from me, and 1 turned at a right-degree angle. They were talking together, using very expressive hand gestures and vigorous head nods, and then suddenly, as if feeling my eyes upon them, the conversation immediately stopped, and everything went very still, and then all 3 heads turned to face in my direction, and those were the longest seconds of my entire life, for I have never felt such a paralysing, disabling fear as I felt in that moment. I was being studied intently by 3 pairs of very keen eyes that seemed to exude a red eye shine at about 8 to 10 feet off the ground. In that second my whole body froze like a solid block of ice, and my body began to tremble and shake uncontrollably like a jelly. I could see a small critter, hunched on the ground, rifling through the contents of my backpack, placing them in some kind of organised chaos, and inspecting and fiddling with anything that was in some way of interest to him. I could see his large fingers examining and inspecting everything with a fervent and curious interest as he rubbed his thick fingers over my camping accessories. Then there was another critter that I hadn't seen before, that was happily poking away at my dwindling fire, and adding more wood to reignite and revive the flames. It was clear that this critter was no stranger to fire, and knew exactly what he was doing. The three critters that I'd previously seen talking intently boldly walked towards me, positioning themselves in a standing position about 3 yards from my tent. I knew at once that they were Bigfoot, but the humanness of these creatures far exceeded their ape-like influences, for they looked like humans covered in long flowing dark hair, with overlong arms, pyramid-shaped heads, and colossal-sized bodies. The largest of the critters stepped forward, and in that moment I was overcome with the most paralysing fear, because I was standing in the presence of a giant-like monster that made me feel like an inconspicuous ant in his presence. The huge giant-like being tapped his chest 3 times, articulated a couple of words that I did not discern, but I knew at once he was telling me what his name was. In that instant relief washed over me like the gentle wave of a sea. I visibly relaxed, so I tapped my chest a couple of times and said, "Heathcliff." Soon every critter had tapped their chest and made a strange sound, which I assumed was their name. I was astonished not only by the friendliness of these critters, but their extraordinary intelligence. I almost got the distinct impression that they were welcoming me to their territory as some kind of honoured guest. It was like they were pleased I was actually there, and I'm certain that they'd never seen a human like me before, because they eyed me with an intense interest. The critter who'd opened my backpack pointed to the massive selection of fruit I'd brought with me, which is what I'd planned to leave out for Bigfoot anyway, if indeed I had been fortunate enough to have an encounter. I indicated to the critters that they were welcome to have the fruit, and they seemed to understand, because they didn't hesitate to take it, and seemed heartily pleased with the gift. The alpha male said a few words, and pointed to the distance, and then I watched them glide away in the night, armed with 2 shopping bags filled with mixed fruit. When they moved, they were so graceful, it was almost like they floated. In the far distance were mountainous valleys so rugged and treacherous that they would have never been tackled by human beings, but I think the Bigfoot was telling me they lived in those craggy mountains. I retired to my sleeping bag in a complete daze, wondering if that had really happened. Had I truly encountered the mythical creature known as Bigfoot in the middle of the wilderness? In truth, I'd never expected such a congenial encounter, yet the reality that Bigfoot was real hit me still harder than anything else, and I was overwhelmed with a feeling of immense and great joy. When I awoke the following morning, I discovered that the Bigfoots had collected me tons of firewood, and there were 2 large fish tucked in the bowl of my firepot, and I knew that they'd been left there for me by the Bigfoot. Every morning I would watch a large female Bigfoot with sizable breasts playing in the water with about 5 little Bigfoot, all of whom were under 4 foot tall and were clearly juveniles. The one thing I noticed about all the Bigfoots was just how uniquely individual and they were in their appearance, with different face shapes, markings and hair colours. Some of them had hazelnut hair, others had more auburn or blonde tones to their colour. Much like humans, they had different characteristics, temperaments and personalities. I could see this when they interacted together, and it was astonishing how human they were in so many aspects. I watched in wondrous awe as they began throwing pine cones at each other and making animated whoops of delight as they splashed around, and their coordination and grace were utterly astonishing. They knew I was watching them and did not seem to mind, for they were as interested in me as I was in them. And when they didn't think I was looking, they would swiftly glance in my direction and study me curiously, for I am certain I was the first white, hairless humanoid that they'd ever seen. In the days that followed, I saw the Bigfoots in the early morning and late night, and the mellow, gentle alpha male would come to my tent and pat the roof with his fingers to get my attention. I would climb out of my tent as 3 Bigfoot would be standing there yards away from me. In his hands the alpha male always held a couple of sizable fish which he handed directly to me, and I accepted with a thank you. Sometimes it was a leg of a deer or a hog, but they always brought me something and were so friendly. I enjoyed the fresh meat every day and cooked it over the fire pit, and it was delicious. The critters seemed intent on protecting me. I hadn't noticed this at first, as they appreciated my vulnerability and lack of skill in their territory, so they would leave me, one of the Bigfoots, to attend to my fire during the night while I slept, and to stand guard over me. On occasion I would hear the Bigfoot on guard duty growl and roar aggressively when a predator like a bobcat approached my camp. The roar from the Bigfoot was infinitely more terrifying than the roar of a lion. They had the tonal capacity to cause my chest to reverberate, and even for the ground to shake. I think the lake was a drawing card for many animals, but they invariably scuttled away upon encountering Bigfoot. For indeed, with my very eyes, when I heard a raucous commotion outside my tent one night, I crawled out to investigate what was going on, and I was to witness a curious grizzly bear scouting my campsite. But upon seeing the angry Bigfoot, he scuttled away in fear, without even attempting to challenge the critter. I've never seen a grizzly intimidated like that before, which is why I'm certain that the Bigfoot is the apex predator in these parts, respected by all the animals, including the grizzly bear himself. On one occasion the alpha male had a huge deer slung over his shoulders like a sack of potatoes, as if it weighed nothing. I remember thinking how tiny the deer looked in his humongous shoulders, for there are no words I can use to ever express the girth, width and mass of these critters, for every part of their gargantuan bodies is solid muscle. I think they could easily lift a car without breaking a sweat, for such is their strength, power, might and loftiness. Although I spent a week at the camping site, my interactions with the critters were at best random and brief, but memorable and special at the same time. And although friendly and welcoming, they were elusive creatures by nature. Yet every interaction I had with the critters was always warm and convivial, and they seemed so determined to make me feel welcome. I felt like an invited special guest, and it was almost as if they regarded the land, the mountain and the lake as all their territory. On my last night they knew I was going. This has left me to conclude that they have some kind of telepathic ability, or sixth sense if you like. For indeed 15 Bigfoot gathered around my camp, tapped their chests 3 times, and told me their names. They said something I couldn't understand, but in my mind it was like I heard these words in my head. I know it sounds weird and outlandish, as this is something that I still struggle to get my head around today. But this is what I heard. We're delighted to have had you as our guest, and would wish you well on your journey back home. And I hope your visit has been of a pleasure, and you have found what it is you are seeking or searching for. The alpha male presented me with the most beautiful large emerald, and then they all glided away, leaving me staring at the jewel in disbelief and wonder. I mean, this is an emerald we're talking about. Had I really heard those words in my head, or was it in my imagination? But it had seemed so real. I had come here for what I was searching for. I'd found the answer to my question, that Bigfoot was real. Now my quest was finished. The itch had been scratched. I considered myself so privileged to encounter such remarkable creatures like these, of whom I shall never forget, for they occupy a very precious place in my heart. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Miss Nora Trevelli loved her grandson Dustin more than anything else in the world, but her clingingly claustrophobic love was insufferable, as her affections were absolutely obsessive, which was far from healthy. By all accounts, the recipients of such lethal affections would likely want to get the hell away from what many might deem to be a poisonously toxic and downright dangerous love, to say the very least. The trouble is that sometimes when the fly gets ensnared into the silken fibres of a spider web that it never ever saw coming, it doesn't always realise what's happening, until of course it's far too late. Certainly Dustin Trevelli had no concept at all of how much of a threat his grandmother's love really imposed long-term, or what it might potentially mean for him in the future, when his grandmother's obsessiveness would become so much more apparent. But at this early stage of his young life,
He naively believed his grandmother's love was of the protective kind, so he felt very loved by her, and in return he loved her very much, looking upon her as the quintessential maternal figure in his life, and her influences over him were extremely powerful. Nora Trevelyan watched over Dustin with the dogged fixation that a hawk might watch over her fledglings, but unlike a hawk that would eventually let the baby birds fly away to begin a life anew, once they had acquired the quintessential skills needed to survive on their own in the wild. By contrast, Nora Trevelyan would never ever allow Dustin to leave home freely, when he got to the age when most kids left home. Not if she had her way in the matter, that is. And Nora Trevelyan was very good at getting her own way, in almost everything. It was a proficient skill she had acquired even as a little girl, when she had successfully manipulated her own parents to give her everything she ever wanted. In Nora Trevelyan's misguided, warped eyes, Dustin belonged to her, like a possession, rather than a person, that she believed she owned, like you might own a horse, a dog, or even a home. Of course, Dustin was not fully aware of the tight, restraining hold that his grandmother had over him, as his grandmother's restrictive restraints that she harnessed over his life, he mistakenly always misconstrued as a devoted, protective love. Ostensibly, a much more discerning person would definitely see the dark, incessant hold that Nora Trevelyan had over her grandson's life. But for a 13-year-old boy, he didn't notice these things, like a very naive swimmer might not notice they're bathing in sharp, infested waters, until of course it's too late. Nora Trevelyan would like Dustin to permanently remain under the stronghold of her salient charge for the rest of her days. But deep down in her gut, she knew keeping such a tight rein over her grandson, as he got older, would not be a walk in the park for her. She certainly knew she might come against some rebellious resistance on his part, so typically seen in a young teenager. Dustin would likely not take kindly to feeling trapped by his grandmother, and Nora knew this very well. She was desirous for her grandson to love her unconditionally, to believe her to be the perfect grandmother. She did not want his perception of her to become tainted in any way, or for her relationship to be soured. So she needed to handle her relationship with Dustin with kid gloves, as if he was a fragile piece of bone china that could easily break. Nora was a master manipulator, and knew how to twist things to her advantage, and Dustin was still malleable at this young age, as far as she was concerned, so he could be successfully moulded into a way she wanted him to become, much like a potter might direct the outcome of the clay he was shaping, turning it into an item that benefits his liking. Nora had adopted some underhanded, cunning ways to turn things to her distinct advantage, to thwart the threats that came her way, if and when they did. We're talking about the kind of threats that might steal her beloved grandson away from her for good, so that he could independently live a life away from her, when he reached that tumultuous age when young men tended to leave home to attend college or begin a career of some kind. Nora Trevelyan did not want that to happen under any circumstances, if she could possibly help it and prevent it. She wanted her grandson Dustin to believe that it was his personal select choice to live with her indefinitely and long term, and not the other way round. She needed to make him desire to stay exactly where he was, and to grow extremely attached to his home, so that leaving it would never even cross his mind, for even a second. Should one day her grandson decide to get married, which Nora hoped would never ever happen, she would cross that bridge when she came to it. If the worst came to the worst, maybe Dustin would bring a wife into their fold, so that there would be 3 members of the household. But as long as her grandson remained under her roof, Nora would be happy. However, if any future girlfriend or potential wife had the audacity to get in her way and try to stir up trouble for her, they would need to be dealt with ruthlessly. Nora didn't doubt that disposing of a human being couldn't be all that hard. You just needed to be clever about it and point the evidence of their demise in another direction. She had read about serial killers in the past, and found the way they complicated things when it came to their duplicitous deeds was absolutely pathetic. As far as Nora was concerned, when it came to getting rid of a dead body, you needed to just simplify things so that it would be difficult for the police to connect all the dots. It would seem the older Dustin got, the more possessive Nora Trevelyan became towards him, as anyone getting too close to her grandson in ways she did not deem appropriate or remotely acceptable, she would view these potential people like cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. Nora Trevelyan was determined to keep tabs on her grandson throughout his life, dictating his path that he took, so that she had a measure of control over things, as Nora liked to have both hands firmly fixed on the steering wheel, and she always wanted to be seated in the driver's side seat, dictating the course of their lives. Nora had been born and raised in Denver, and when she became a grandmother at a young age, she had lived with her grandson, raising him as her own. It would seem incessant snoopiness of neighbours and interference from well-meaning friends and family had got decidedly on her nerves. She had realized moving to a family-sized cabin in the Colorado countryside, where she could homeschool her grandson and give him a very secluded life, away from prying eyes, was exactly what was needed to keep the harassing vultures away from their lives and give them the privacy she craved. As far as Nora was concerned, these annoying people that were interested in her grandson were like tiny little fruit gnats hovering over rotten fruit and impossible to squat away, and the only way to get rid of them was to dispose of the fruit. So moving Dustin away from such annoying interlopers seemed like a jolly good idea. By all accounts, when they were living in Denver together, Dustin was annoyingly popular and well-liked. He had a plethora of devoted friends. He seemed to enjoy a variety of after-school activities that included horse-riding lessons over the weekend. And Dustin was a very good rider. For Nora it seemed impossible at times to keep her beady eyes on his every move, especially as he got older, as it got increasingly hard to keep watch over him. To all intents and purposes, the answer and solution to her problems came when she decided that she and her grandson Dustin would move to the sequestered cabin, far enough away from Denver, so that people could not get their grubby little claws into him, or succeed in influencing her grandson's thoughts with some of their warped ideas that might one day encourage him to leave home for good. Nora needed to put a stop to that kind of thing right away. She needed to be ahead of herself to prevent the future roadblocks that invariably might come up to haunt her one of these days, of which there might be many. In her mind's eye, moving away from Denver was the perfect escape for the two of them. This way she could keep tabs on her grandson, without the rude interferences of well-meaning strangers. The promise she had made Dustin about buying him the horse he'd always longed for meant that moving to the countryside had been met with very little resistance. She had suspected that that would happen. She had known that the temptation of owning a horse would prove to be an irresistible allure for Dustin, one that he would not easily turn away. "You mean if we move away, I can have my own horse?" Dustin had said with excited eyes that were as large as saucers. Nora had nodded, inwardly suppressing a calculating smile. Things were going the way she had anticipated. "But of course," Nora had said. "If we move to the countryside, you can have anything you want, Dustin, and that is a promise." Let's just say, a wild animal in a cage will always look for an opportunity to escape, if it's presented. But that's only if the animal in question knows, of course, that it's trapped in the first place. And Dustin did not know he was walking straight into a trap of his grandmother's making. One of these days Dustin would surely wake up and smell the coffee. Maybe then he would realize that Nora had put him into a gilded, very cozy cage that did not appear to be a trap at all. That was part of the problem. One of these days Dustin would surely wake up and smell the coffee. Maybe then he would realize that Nora had put him into a gilded, very cozy, sumptuous cage that didn't appear to be a trap at all. That was part of the trick, of course. One day he might come to fully comprehend the tight grip that Nora Trevelyan had had over his young life. Nora had a jealous, possessive side to her narcissistic nature. This had developed from when she was a little girl. If anyone had been desirous to play with her things that had been given to her by her parents, she would ultimately seek revenge in the most subtle way she could, so that the blame would never be directed her way. Nora had quickly learnt the ingenious art of being cunning, masterfully manipulative, and never ever accountable for anything she did that was considered wrong, as if anyone was at fault, it would never be her. One day when Nora was about 7 years old, her best friend Kiki had started to play with her precious doll that she'd been given by her parents as a birthday gift that Nora had wanted no one to touch. Nora had been beside herself with indignant rage when Kiki had picked up her doll and begun to play with it indiscriminately, almost as if Nora's doll belonged to her. How dare she? Did Kiki not realize that this was her doll and no one should touch it? Kiki seemed to think that she should be able to play with all of Nora's things as freely as if they were her own. The presumptuous girl had absolutely no boundaries, Nora had thought. She needed to teach her best friend a lesson that she would never forget, so that Kiki would never mess with her things again. "I'm not going to put up with it," Nora had thought to herself. "That's my doll," she had snapped, grabbing her doll away from her bemused friend. "You can't touch it! She's mine!" Nora's mother, Molly, had been startled by her daughter's possessiveness towards her doll, as she had witnessed the scene unfold before her very eyes, and had seen a murderous look in Nora's dark eyes that left her feeling rather disquieted. "Nora, there's no need to be like that," she had piped. "Why don't you let Kiki play with your doll? She'll let you play with hers. It's very good to learn to share your toys together. Your siblings all learnt to share their things together, especially when we were hard up, and you would do well to do the same, Nora." Nora had indignantly stamped her white-stockinged feet, rather belligerently, and insolently said, "Cindy is my doll. No one can play with her. She belongs to me. She's mine." She had glared at her mother furiously for daring to suggest that her toy should be shared with the likes of Kiki. Everyone needed to know that they could not touch anything that belonged to her. Mrs. Trevelyan had been shocked by her daughter's outrageous dogmatic attitude, which she deemed as highly inappropriate and unsavoury. She had expressed her misgivings to her husband Gabe. "Oh, Gabe, I don't know what is going on in our daughter's head. I really don't understand her at times. You should have seen the pugnacious way she was behaving when playing with Kiki. It was upsetting how incredibly aggressive she got towards her friend over the doll we gave her for her birthday. She wouldn't let Kiki touch it. It wasn't natural, Gabe. She was practically hissing at Kiki like a viper. She didn't want Kiki going anywhere near that doll of hers. It was horrible to watch. I was quite disturbed by the whole affair. None of our other children have behaved like Nora. I'm really worried about her, Gabe. I think there's a nasty side to our little girl." "I wouldn't worry about it," Gabe had said, shrugging his shoulders nonchalantly. "You know kids can be very possessive about their things, can't they? I think it's not as abnormal as you seem to think, love. And as for being nasty, Nora's a very sweet little girl. People only have nice things to say about her. The teachers at her school love her, do they not?" "The teachers may love her, Gabe, but they don't know her, do they? There's something very disturbing about Nora. I sometimes see a look in her eyes when she doesn't get her way, a very frightening, cruel look that I don't like at all. Nora manipulates people, Gabe. That's the way she works. She turns on the charm when it suits her like a warm tap. And everybody naively laps up our little girl's false charm like a cat with its milk. But there's an insidious side to our girl that I've seen, Gabe, a side that turns my blood icy cold." Gabe had reached out to grab his wife's hand, to give it an encouraging squeeze. He could see she was disquieted. He didn't know how to comfort her, as he was loath to admit that he too had been eyewitness to a dark side of his daughter's personality, that he liked to pretend was not there, like a hole in the ceiling he refused to notice, otherwise it might require his attention and some kind of fix-up job. And how on earth did you fix up a belligerent little girl who was bloody-minded and self-indulgent? A week later, when Nora had been invited to have lunch at Kiki's house, she had feigned an excuse during lunch about needing to go to the bathroom. She had clandestinely sneaked into Kiki's bedroom to find her best friend's favourite doll. She had ripped off the doll's head with a forceful thrust so it could never be put back together again. She had dismembered it with brute force, pulling off the doll's arms and legs, and then she'd made a shortcut to the swimming pool to finish off the doll so that it could be drowned in the water. It had felt wonderful to murder Kiki's doll. There was no feeling quite so satisfying. She had promptly returned to the lunch table, acting as if nothing had happened. Nora had made absolutely sure that Kiki's favourite doll could never ever be fixed, repaired or restored, as that girl needed to pay for what she'd done. Nora had surreptitiously thrown the doll's head and all its forlorn-looking disembodied parts that she had ripped off from the legs to the arms into the swimming pool at the deepest end, so the doll had later been recovered by a very distraught Kiki, floating upside down in the swimming pool, its hair knotted and tangled, the face almost bleached from the pool chemicals. It was a sorry sight indeed. The doll could not be salvaged, so had been buried in the backyard. Kiki had known that Nora had done this to get her revenge on her for playing with Nora's doll. Her friend could be mean. It was just sad that nobody took the matter very seriously. Even Kiki's own nonchalant parents were indifferent and rather blinded as to what was going on beneath their noses. They were both blasé and insouciant about the incident. I mean, why would an adult really concern themselves with their daughter's doll that had ended up in the pool in bits? It wasn't that big a deal, and dolls could always be replaced, couldn't they? Kiki's parents blamed the family dog Biscuit for running off with the doll and dismembering it, as that is what they believe had happened. They could not believe that such an adorable child like Nora, with bucket loads of charm and oodles of personality, would ever do something like that. No one would dare to believe that she was capable of such treachery. Kiki's doll had been permanently ruined, and this had brought Nora a great deal of sadistic pleasure. She privately delighted in her friend's grief, and when Kiki confronted her about the matter of her doll being so cruelly destroyed, Nora was in denial about the matter, and behaved as if she was quite affronted that her best friend could have such a low opinion of her. Of course, she'd never have dreamed of pulling the head off Kiki's doll, or tearing off its limbs and throwing the doll into the swimming pool. She was not adverse to blaming it on Biscuit like her parents had done. But Kiki was a smart child. She was astute, and she was not buying into Nora's denials. She was also very aware that the family spring Charles Spaniel Biscuit was not inclined to play with her toys. So she knew the truth, and Nora's saccharine sweetness over the whole event made her feel biliously sick. "You tore my doll's head off, didn't you, Nora?" she challenged her friend. "Don't blame it on Biscuit. Biscuit would never damage my doll. I know you did it. You slipped off during lunch, didn't you, to get my doll and to throw it into the swimming pool? I'm not stupid. I know you did it. You might fool my parents, but you don't fool me. They think you're always nice, but I know the truth about you. You're angry, aren't you? That's because I played with your doll last week. You wanted to get back at me, didn't you? You've destroyed my favourite doll. How could you do that to me? I'll never be able to put her head back on." Kiki had cried sorrowful tears. She had turned to her mother for support, but none came, as Kiki's mother thought the sun shone out of Nora's backside, and that she was incapable of doing anything mean. "Mummy, I know Nora did this to my doll on purpose. It's 'cause I played with her dolly." "Don't be ridiculous, Kiki," her mother had reprimanded her. "Nora would never do a mean thing like that to your doll. You cannot go laying false accusations against your best friend. You didn't do this, did you, Nora? Of course I wouldn't do something like that, Mrs. Phillips, said Nora, shaking her head defiantly. I wouldn't do such a spiteful thing, 'cause I know that Kiki really loves that doll of hers so very much. I know when we were having lunch, I saw Biscuit running towards the pool. She had something in her mouth. I think it must have been, Kiki's doll. There you are, love. Nora saw Biscuit carrying your doll to the swimming pool. She's a very naughty dog, but never mind, we'll replace your doll for you. But I don't want any other doll. I want the one I've lost. Kiki would look at Nora's dark, soulless eyes and observe a delighted, satisfied smirk within them. It was a gleeful, indulgent look on her face that said what no words could spell out more clearly or more conspicuously. Don't go playing with my things again. If you want to preserve your other toys, or next time I'll do something 1,000 times worse. And Kiki had wisely heeded her warning. She had picked up the subliminal message. She better not do anything that would provoke Nora to anger again. It just wasn't worth it. Kiki was eyewitness to a dark side to Nora Trevelyan's personality, and throughout her young childhood she did her level best to avoid encountering that side of her friend's character. Sometimes, when she was playing with Nora, she felt as if she was navigating her way across a field of landmines. Most people would wonder why Kiki didn't want to abandon her friendship with Nora for good, but such people would never understand their friendship. Despite everything, Kiki really liked Nora's good side, and there were times that Nora could be genuinely kind and fun to be around. Kiki enjoyed spending time with her best friend, like you might enjoy playing with your tabby cat, even if your cat lashes out at you from time to time with its sharp claws. It doesn't stop you wanting to play with it. Despite everything, you enjoy being with your tabby cat. In the same way, Kiki enjoyed being with her best friend. Kiki needed to play her games cautiously. In her humble opinion, she could manage her friendship with Nora if she treaded carefully, by always remaining guarded and ensuring she didn't do or say anything to inspire her friend's vengeful wrath. On the surface, if you were deceived by appearances, Nora looked to be a very sweet, demure little girl. She was pleasing on the eye, loved by the townsfolk, who thought she was a delightful little girl with fine table manners, who'd been brought up to be well behaved by her devoted parents. Little did people know that Nora Trevelyan was about as duplicitous as you could get. Indeed, people would say over and over again what a delightful child she was. These ignorant people were unable to know that beneath the very benign, benevolent and charming veneer of this little girl lurked a very dark side that had the potential to become significantly more dark in the years to come. A thorn bush does not change itself into something benign. It always remains thorny, and if you aren't careful, those thorns are capable of inflicting much damage. In a nutshell, narcissists that display a penchant for grandiosity artfully enjoy stealing the limelight of approval and attention from the people around them that they can exploit to their own advantage. Nora succeeded in duping everybody who knew her. If she had no need of you, she would spit you out for breakfast like the pips in an olive. Some people had unfortunately been exposed to the less than redeeming side of her personality, but if they dared to mention there was something insidious about Nora, they'd be shut down by her devoted fan club, who would not have a bad word said about the young girl. The only person, much like Kiki herself, that knew all too well that Nora was not this bright ball of light that lit up the world with her selflessness and charismatic charm that had seduced so many, was, of course, her own mother, Molly. For sometimes a mother may see in their children what others fail to see, and it's not always pretty. That was certainly the case for Molly Trevelyan, who didn't like the growing malevolence she had observed in her daughter over the years. She would find her daughter's callous behaviour over the most insignificant things grossly disturbing. It would be in the quiet serenity of her disturbed thoughts that she would often wonder what her daughter would one day become. She had been plagued with ominous nightmares of Nora with a pickaxe hacking someone to death. She couldn't believe she could envisage her daughter in such an atrocious light, but she really could. Sometimes she got flashing images of screaming voices calling out for help, decapitated heads, sharp instruments, blood-covered sheets, and she would see the images of Nora with a gormless, twisted grin on her face, standing over a deceased cadaver. Molly would wake up from a nightmare, sweating profusely, with a palpitating heart. She told herself to stop being so ridiculous. "My daughter's no murderer. She may be many things, but she's not a murderer," she kept persuading herself. But deep down in her gut, she knew Nora was capable of a great evil. But she buried those hostile thoughts away, like a squirrel stashes away its acorns over the winter season, and forgets where it put them, because some things did not bear thinking about. Nora had been the youngest daughter of 7 children, where she'd grown up in a large family home in Denver. Her parents had been pillars of the community and regularly attended the local church every Sunday. Nora's father would often read out biblical passages in front of the congregation. He would also chaperone people to their seats, so he became a full-time usher. Nora had come along as a late lamb in the family. There was a 5-year age difference between her and her youngest sibling, a little boy called Robin. So she'd ended up being unduly spoilt by both her parents. It would seem her father had inherited a vast sum of money from his grandfather after he had died, which had exponentially changed their lives for the better. Molly and Gabe Trevelli fussed over little Nora with a shameless indulgence, in a way they had never done with their other children, as money had not been so forthcoming back then. And if you've got money to lavish on your kids, why not spoil them? The Trevellis would buy Nora absolutely everything the little girl wanted. No was not a word that entered their vocabulary. Nora's own siblings had been told to share things when they'd been growing up, and sometimes they'd even worn each other's cast-offs. But Nora got everything brand new. In the beginning, both parents were so beguiled and enchanted by little Nora. After all, she was their late lamb. They didn't have the heart to refuse her anything, which would be something her mother Molly would later very much regret. Nora became a precocious brat. She had escaped the rigorous rules and disciplineship that the couple's other children had been subjected to. The favour Nora received from her parents had not gone unnoticed by her siblings, who took offence to the privileges their little sister was receiving from their parents, which they deemed as incredibly unfair, and rightly so. They were the first to notice that Nora was becoming a self-entitled little brat, and were quick to point these facts out to their parents. "What's wrong with you, Mum?" Molly's oldest daughter Meg had cried out indignantly. "You give Nora no boundaries whatsoever. You let her get away with anything. She's turning into quite the brat. She's a molly-coddled little madam. I do understand Dad inherited a lot of money from his grandfather, but don't spoil a little girl too much. It'll backfire against you, I promise you that." Nora's mother began to fear that her oldest daughter Meg was absolutely right. She began to privately chastise herself for having given Nora so much, for her daughter was beginning to exhibit temper tantrums if she wasn't the centre of attention and didn't get her way. Mrs. Trevelli found it was easier to give in to Nora than to be subjected to her pugnacious outbursts. "I want it, and I'm going to have it!" Nora would scream furiously. "If you don't buy it for me now, I will scream so loudly that everybody will look at you. I will make a big scene." Mrs. Trevelli would crumble at her daughter's threats, not wanting her brat to draw any unwanted attention to her. Mrs. Trevelli began to worry when the cracks in Nora's veneer began to show, when she became a belligerently capricious teenager, not adverse to telling her mother how much she hated and abhorred her, and randomly throwing around her mother's finest china to wreak her revenge on her. Nora knew full well her mother was passionate about her valuable china collection, so she was terribly pleased to get her mother where it hurt the most. Nora had delighted in seeing the grief-stricken look on Molly's face. It made her feel good to upset her mother this much. Molly Trevelyan knew Nora's outrageous behaviour should not be tolerated under any circumstances. Molly's other children had never exhibited such ungracious, deplorable behaviour before. Indeed, had they done so, she would have nipped it in the bud a long time ago. But with Nora things were always different. Mrs. Trevelyan was reluctant to discipline Nora, as there was a small, tiny part of her that was afraid of her daughter, although this was something she refused to admit to herself, or to anybody else for that matter. It was so much easier to live in denial, and to clandestinely hope that Nora would one day change her malevolent, spiteful ways. Mrs. Trevelyan had said to her husband, "What have we done, Gabe? This is all our fault. We are responsible for how Nora has turned out. We should never have spent so much money on her. It was a huge mistake. What on earth were we thinking? Our other children are practically angelic compared to Nora, and that's because we raised them right, with structure and discipline. We made them appreciate everything that they had. But we've let Nora get away with her bad behaviour. She's become so self-entitled and obnoxious. Haven't you noticed how she can turn on the charm at the drop of a hat to get what she wants? But there's a malicious side to Nora. Now she's a teenager, I don't like what I'm seeing. She's like a wildfire you can't control, and wildfires have the potential to become life-threateningly dangerous."
Gabe had replied, "Don't you worry, my love. Nora will grow out of it, I know she will. Yes, she's a cantankerous teenager, but they all go through these kinds of trials and tribulations when they're growing up. It's like a rite of passage, is it not? I'm quite sure when I was Nora's age I was equally as disagreeable. In fact, I'm pretty sure I was." Nora Trevelyan had frowned. "I don't think so, Gabe. I don't think you were as disagreeable as Nora is. That would be hard to trump. None of our kids have been obnoxious like this, Gabe. I can assure you of that, as I keep telling you. I'm probably beginning to sound like a broken record, as I keep repeating the same thing over and over again. But I promise you this, Gabe. There is something not right about our little girl. There is an insidious side to her character that she keeps very well concealed from people. But I believe Kiki is well aware of it, as is Meg, our older daughter. She's also incredibly perceptive, and even you are, Gabe, even though I know you refuse to admit it. I hate to say this, love, but I've seen you give Nora a rather worried look at times. I think you can sense there's something off about our little girl, or our big girl, if I put it better. Go on, admit it, Gabe. You can say it, you know." "What do you want me to do, love? Admit that we have a problem child? I don't want to go down that path. I really don't. I know you're very disquieted about Nora, but we'll take things one step at a time before overreacting."
Mrs. Trevelyan let out a huge, exasperated sigh. She knew that Gabe did not want to respond, but she continued the conversation rather unwillingly. But some things needed to be addressed, even if the subject in question was not terribly easy to discuss.
"I hate to say this to you, Gabe, and point the blindingly obvious, but there have been so many incidents over the years regarding our Nora that have left me feeling very perturbed and upset. Do you remember when Pastor Allen, bless his cotton socks, came to dinner that night? There was a great big fat green caterpillar wiggling around on his plate, which wasn't there when I served up the meal to him. The thing was gargantuan. I don't think I've ever seen such an enormous caterpillar. There is no way I would have missed a caterpillar of that size. The thing was the size of a small sausage." "I remember the incident very well, love," said Gabe, chuckling. "It was hilariously funny, you have to admit it. Especially to see the huge caterpillar wiggling around on Pastor Allen's plate. And his expression. Well, it was impossible to keep a straight face.
especially when the large caterpillar began eating the lettuce on the side of his plate, next to the lasagna. Well, I'm glad you found it amusing, Gabe. I certainly wasn't laughing. Poor Pastor Allen. He was a guest in our home, an honorary guest for that matter. And as his hosts, I wanted us to show him a good time in our home. But Nora ruined the whole dining experience for us. For the record, Gabe, that big fat ugly caterpillar made a miraculous appearance when Nora took the pastor's plate from me to present to him. What are you implying, love? Asked Gabe, raising a silvery brow. Why do I have a funny feeling I know where this is going? You're so predictable, love. You're going to blame Nora, aren't you, for putting the fat green caterpillar on the pastor's plate? I'm sure she wouldn't do that, love. And even if she did do it, is it such a big deal, really? Please, Gabe, I hate it when you're in denial like this. And for your information, yes, it is a very big deal. You don't know your daughter well enough, it's clear to me. I can assure you, Gabe, that Nora deliberately parked that caterpillar on Pastor Allen's plate. And whether you found it amusing or not is beside the point. It was not a nice thing for her to do. Gabe shrugged his shoulder. All this fuss about a caterpillar, isn't that a tad ridiculous, love? The thing was harmless. The incident was funny. Can't we put this behind us? Do we need to harp over events like this, that border on the ridiculous and the insane? No, we can't put this behind us, Gabe. I know you want to believe Nora is sweetness and light, but I was the one that washed the lettuce thoroughly that night. If that enormous caterpillar had been in the lettuce, I would have found him. I could see the delighted smirk on Nora's face when the pastor visibly squirmed. I've never been so embarrassed and humiliated in my entire life. Even when I served the pastor a new plate of lasagna, he never ate terribly much. I can't blame him for that. I'm sure he was put off anything I served him up after that. God knows what the poor man was thinking. He was probably terrified of dessert, not knowing what was going to meet him on his dessert plate. What are you trying to say, love? You are not being very kind about Nora. You're immediately assuming she's behind all of this. But she is, Gabe. She is. Don't you get that? She's got you wrapped around her little finger. But you need to know what she's really like. She's got a macabre sense of satisfaction from doing things like that. I can see it in her eyes. She loves to set the cat among the pigeons and cause discord wherever she goes, without people ever knowing that she's the one that set the whole thing up in the first place. She clandestinely covers her tracks well, but I'm not fooled, Gabe, for a moment, even if you are. I despair of her, Gabe, I really do. God forbid if she doesn't like you. You don't want to make an enemy out of our daughter. Oh, for goodness sake, love. You're taking this far too far. Our daughter's only a teenager. How much harm can a teenager do? That daughter of ours deliberately breaks things of mine if I upset her, and I know she does. Suddenly I'll find something that she's purposely smashed, and I'll know she did it intentionally, to get her back at me. Oh, love, I wish you wouldn't say things like that. You don't know that for sure. But I do, Gabe, I do. Remember when I said she couldn't go to Kiki's house the one day? The next day I found that perfect white dress I'd bought from the boutique in town, that cost me an arm and a leg, was covered in a red wine stain on the front. Now how did it get there, Gabe? It was Nora. I know it was. Deny it as much as you like, but I know what that girl is capable of. I refused her to go, and she wanted me to know that she would get her back on me, and she did. And I loved that dress, Gabe. I really did. You're reading far too much into this, love. Honestly, I don't think Nora's that mean. I don't think she would deliberately set out to hurt you like that. Maybe you accidentally spilled the wine on your dress when you were hanging it up in your wardrobe. You often drink wine in the bedroom, don't you? There's probably a simple explanation to what happened. "That is where you're wrong, love," Molly Trevelyan had replied rather curtly. "I wish you weren't so deceived by our daughter, Gabe. She's pulled the wool right over your eyes, as she's done for many people in her life. But Kiki knows what she's like. And I think underneath it you do too, Gabe. I've been watching our daughter. There's a side to her personality that completely lacks empathy. I think Nora is a narcissist who takes pleasure in upsetting people if she believes they've done her wrong. And even if they haven't, in some warped, satisfying way, she gets her kicks from causing disquiet. I feel afraid of Nora at times, Gabe. I really do. I'm scared of being angry with her, in case she does something mean out of spite to get her back on me. I can't trust her to behave." "Honestly, love, I don't like to say this, but I'm going to say it. I think you're being unreasonably hard on our daughter. Nora is a good girl, really. She's had her moments, of course she has, like many teenagers do. I mean, let's not kid, teenagers are notorious for having a reputation of giving their parents loads of grief. And a turbulent ride, and Nora has done that extremely well. She's not the first in that regard, and I dare say she will not be the last." It would seem that Gabe was stubbornly refusing to admit that they had a problematic child. Maybe as a father, he saw speaking badly about one of his children as a betrayal. But deep down in her gut, Molly knew Gabe knew the truth about Nora. "I blame myself, Gabe. In fact, I blame the both of us. We are responsible for how Nora has turned out as her parents. We let her get away with far too much because she was the late lamb in our family. And look what she's turned into, Gabe. A monster. That's what. I hate to say this to you, love, but I don't like Nora very much. In fact, I don't like her at all. I love her because as her mother I'm expected to love her, and she is my daughter by blood. But like her? No, I don't like her at all." "I think you expect me to be shocked with your saying this, that you don't like your daughter. But I can assure you I'm not shocked at all. Many parents speak this way of their teenagers. But whatever is irking you now with Nora, I'm sure we'll both get through it. And one day Nora will surprise you when she becomes a fine young woman. Just give her time. That's all I'm asking you." "Gabe, you don't see what I see. You're completely clueless. I wish you weren't, I really do. Unfortunately, our Nora has charmed the socks off you. You melt like butter when she asks you to do anything for her. None of our other children have had such a hold over you. Think about it, Gabe. Our daughter's behaviour has never been normal." "Look, love, you really do need to calm down. I'm getting tired of this conversation. It's starting to bore me silly. You must begin to realise that our daughter is a teenager. She gives us a few problems, that's all. But it's perfectly natural. There's nothing wrong with our girl. You need to get that idea right out of your head." Molly Trevelyan had not been wrong about her brutally honest assessment of her daughter Nora, but getting Gabe to agree about this was close to impossible. The man, like so many people she knew, was so stubbornly in denial. She might as well quit while she was ahead, or they'd end up having an ongoing argument that would probably never reach a climax. She had known all too well that regretfully, sometimes in a bird's nest, a bad egg has been laid, and no matter what you may do to help it hatch out right, some things are meant to be bad. Just like when you crack open an egg to use in a cake recipe, or to make an omelette, and you realise it's gone off. There's not a thing you can do to redeem the egg. The only thing you can do is throw it out, for it is good for nothing, and is past saving. Let's just say if you got on Nora Trevelyan's wrong side, getting ill would be the last of your concerns, as the wrath of that girl could not be underestimated, and this is what Molly Trevelyan had come to realise about her daughter. All these years later, after the undulating ups and downs of Nora's tempestuous childhood and her rather challenging teenage years, where she'd brought much grief to her parents, most particularly her mother. These days Nora herself was now a grandmother, who was extremely besotted and devoted over her grandson Dustin, and would never have had a bad word said about him. But unlike Nora Trevelli, Dustin was a good boy, with not a nasty bone in his body, a far cry from his grandmother in that regard. Suffice to say, Nora had never married, but had become pregnant with her daughter Kendall when she was 19 years old, much to the shock horror of both Molly and Gabe Trevelli. Even Gabe Trevelli had been forced to admit that this time Nora had gone too far, as it reflected very badly on the Trevelli family, who were considered upstanding citizens in their community. A scandal like this could easily destroy their family's glowing reputation. At such a harrowing time, only a couple of generations back, having a baby out of wedlock ultimately brought much shame on the entire family. It certainly would have done so for the Trevellis, and they couldn't have that happen to them. Many parents placed in similar taxing circumstances would be forced to go to extreme measures to cover up what had happened to their teenager. They would secretly squirrel their pregnant teenager away to have their child in a special private place designed for young mothers, usually a convent of some sort, so that prying eyes would not know about their dirty family secret. Regretfully for many, the truth would sometimes come out, and the gossiping and unkind words would become rife. Likewise, Molly Trevelli had covered up her daughter's pregnancy well, and after Kendall was born, Molly raised Nora's daughter as her very own. Molly Trevelli and her husband Gabe had masterfully managed to curtail the wagging tongues in town, as Mrs. Trevelli was still young enough to have had a late child, although she'd sworn after Nora was born that there would be no more children. But for her, raising her grandchild had been an absolute pleasure. Molly Trevelli had gone around town wearing a fake baby bump for the duration of the full 9 months, ensuring it got bigger at the right time, so that no one suspected a single thing. It helped, of course, that Molly Trevelli was a natural actress, so she convinced many that she was indeed pregnant. Keeping Nora's pregnancy cloak and dagger had not been easy by any manner of means, but Molly Trevelli had it all under control, and she refused to allow their family name to be dragged through the mud. Gabe Trevelli had sent Nora to Italy to spend time with his Italian relatives, where Nora stayed with both of his parents in their rustic farmhouse, where they grew groves of oranges and lemons for a living. Everyone in town thought Nora had gone to Italy to learn to speak Italian, so that one day she'd be fluent and be able to work for the Italian embassy. And she did return from Italy, completely fluent as it happens in the language, and so having a second language under her belt had seemed like a good reason for her to have gone away. She had enjoyed her time in Italy, and did at one point consider emigrating, but then decided against it. She decided she'd rather stay in America. The locals brought the lie without knowing that the Trevelli family had a dark secret that they had shrouded from their eyes, and they had been completely hoodwinked. By all accounts, even the boy that had made Nora pregnant had no knowledge that he was the father, which is just the way the Trevelli family wanted to keep it. Kendall was born in Italy. She was delivered in Nora's relative's farmhouse, where a midwife had been brought to help with the delivery. She had encouraged Nora to have a water birth, which was unusual for the time, but was growing in popularity among the unconventional types, who liked to do things rather differently. When Nora returned home to Denver with a little bundle in her hands, she surreptitiously handed it over to her mother, who claimed to have birthed Kendall herself. Kendall was born a healthy 7 pounds and 3 ounces. She had bright, deep green eyes with flecks of hazel within them, and wisps of dark curly hair that was so typical of the Italian side of the family. Molly had fallen in love with the little baby from the moment she had laid eyes on her beloved grandchild. Kendall reminded her so very much of her husband Gabe. Everybody told Molly how lucky she was to have such a late child. Of course she played the part of the devoted mother incredibly well, which of course was not terribly hard to do, as she adored her grandchild. People were amazed how quickly Molly's enviably slimmed figure had bounced back after the pregnancy, when one day she appeared to have a large baby bump, and the next it had mysteriously gone, as if by magic. Some young mothers in the area began asking Mrs. Trevelyan for dieting tips on how to lose the post-pregnancy weight as quickly as she had done, which many described as nothing short of miraculous. Nora had felt no attachment or devotion to her baby girl Kendall. On the contrary, she had expressed very little interest in contributing to raising her own child, who she pretended to the world was her sister. Everyone brought into the duplicitous charade, hook, line and sinker, and Nora had liked it that way very much. She got a weird kind of satisfaction from deceiving the locals. She would regularly say to her mother, "How can people be so dim not to know that Kendall is really mine? It's bleedingly obvious, isn't it? Yet they still don't see it. It's hilarious how deceived people can be." Molly Trevelyan would reply, "Well, I'd like to think, Nora dear, that people want to believe the best in us. Don't you?" "Whatever," Nora had replied, rolling her eyes in disgust. "I still say people are inherently stupid when the truth is staring them blazingly in the face, and yet they don't see it." It was only Kiki, who was Nora's childhood friend, who knew the sordid truth about Kendall's mysterious arrival into the world. She also knew that saying anything to anyone in town about the matter would not be in her best interests, so she kept her mouth wisely shut, for she knew better than to upset Nora Trevelyan, as the childhood event with her baby doll had burnt its way indelibly into her memory. Now that Nora was considerably older, Kiki suspected she was capable of far greater spite, but those were not waters she was willing to test under any circumstances. Only a fool would do that. She did, however, tell Nora what she knew. She wanted her best friend to know that she had not been so easily duped. "I know your mother was never pregnant with Kendall," she said defiantly. "Kendall is your baby, isn't she, Nora? I saw you. Don't forget, I saw you and Rolf at the party together. You were in his parents' bedroom while they were out. I knew you weren't playing a game of cards as you claimed you were. I'm not stupid. I wasn't born yesterday. You were getting up to all kinds of hanky-panky. I knew what you were up to, and even at the time I thought to myself, I hope she's being careful, because she might just fall pregnant, and it would be so typical if she did. And then all of a sudden, lo and behold, before you have a chance to show, you hurriedly saunter off to Italy, claiming you want to learn Italian. I remember thinking to myself, oh my goodness, you have never shown any interest whatsoever in your Italian heritage. Now suddenly you want to learn Italian. Then your mother goes around town claiming to be pregnant with a baby bump. I didn't buy that for a single second. You come back home to Denver, having put on weight, and you said the weight gain was all due to the delicious Italian food you had consumed. But I knew that weight gain was not food-related. So what are you trying to say, Kiki? Spell it out, then. Well, your mother's baby bump, I know, was a prothesis. It was designed to deceive people. It wasn't convincing to me. One time it was hanging far too low. I watched your mother hurriedly retreat to the ladies' room, where she quickly corrected the blunder. I saw it all. Once your mother had claimed to have birthed Kendall, unlike other mothers who stay at home to actually recover from giving birth, because believe it or not, having a baby is an exhausting business. But the very next day, your mother is energetically walking around town with Kendall in her pram, a big beam on her face, so big it could sink the Titanic. She was showing Kendall off and was as proud as Punch, and I don't blame her, because Kendall's a beautiful little baby. But lo and behold, after her delivery, her stomach is as flat as a pancake, and that is not normal. Most people didn't figure it out, but I'm not stupid. I knew what had happened. Kiki's rather brusque comments had provoked Nora to anger. She grabbed Kiki by the scarf around her neck, holding it rather tightly, and said to her, "Don't you dare tell anybody about this, will you? Or you will regret it. Do you understand, Kiki?" Kiki had nodded. "Of course. I wouldn't dream of it. One look at the dark fury in Nora's soulless eyes told her that she'd need to keep her lips permanently sealed, if she knew what was good for her, as Nora made her feel terribly afraid when she became indignant, and it didn't do to provoke those porcupine-like spines of hers. Once Nora returned from Italy, she became significantly more tame. She went to university to acquire a BCom, and subsequently ended up making some sound financial investments, so that by the time she was 35 years old, her business savvy and entrepreneurial skills had made her a very wealthy young woman indeed. From an early age, Nora Trevelli had decided that she would never get married. She had no need of a man in her life. Men were surplus to requirements as far as she was concerned. But then again, she thought that about a lot of people in general. Whether they be men or women, it didn't really matter. Nora only ever went after what she needed, or what she deemed would be useful for her in her life. Anything else could be tossed away like the garbage. Nora never cared who she hurt or stepped on to get to her ultimate goal. People just did not matter. In her humble opinion, if she were to settle down and to get married, her husband would steal her independence away from her, robbing her of all her freedoms to live the selfish life she'd like to live. Nora didn't want to sacrifice anything for anyone. There was no doubt that she was an attractive woman. Her good looks had carried her through her teenage years, into her adulthood, serving her well. She had broken many men's hearts along the journey of life, but none of these men knew what a lucky escape they'd had from getting involved with such a treacherous woman like her, who might have your guts for garters, and wouldn't care if she broke your heart into smithereens. Even Nora's friend Kiki had privately wondered that if Nora had in fact married, whether she might have disposed of her husband and buried him under a vegetable patch, if he had made her mad enough. For she certainly believed Nora was capable of doing a wicked thing like this. Yet despite this, she still remained friends with Nora. She knew how to handle her friend. She could never understand why she still remained attached to her, but despite Nora's dark side, Kiki continued to genuinely love her. Even as a youngish grandmother, Nora would still receive admiring glances from mature men, but should they get any funny ideas, Nora would squat them away like the annoying flies on a window pane. She didn't want to be bothered by the affections and attentions from the opposite sex. She couldn't help it if she was an attractive woman, could she? Why should she hide her light under a bushel? Nora was slim with long lean legs and a petite waist. She walked with an elegant gait, and clothes always looked remarkably good on her, which was why when she was a teenager she'd actually done a stint of modelling for a teenage magazine, much to her parents' disapproval, because they didn't like her flaunting herself. But the magazine threw her out, after she called the photographer a lecherous jerk, and had run him down with some cutting derogatory words from that dirty mouth of hers that would have made a filthy diesel engine appear sparklingly clean. It would seem when Kendall was 18 years old that she had disappointed both Molly and Gabe Trevelli by falling pregnant at a similar age to Nora. It would seem history had repeated itself all over again. Kendall had given birth to a baby son she had called Dustin. Molly and Gabe Trevelli were not remotely amused by this fortuitous turn of events. They blamed themselves for what had happened. They had tried their level best to raise Kendall with the boundaries that they had failed to orchestrate in Nora's life. But despite everything, Kendall had replicated the mistakes of her own mother. Much to Molly and Gabe's surprise, Nora had been the one that rescued the situation, saving the day for the Trevelli family. She had vowed that she would take care of her baby grandson. She had insisted on taking Kendall to the clinic to organize birth control for her. And she had also persuaded her daughter to finish school and attend college, encouraging her to make something of her life. Nora had raised Dustin as her own, so that her daughter Kendall could thoroughly enjoy the independence of being a young adult without the responsibilities of childcare. The arrangement had worked out well for all concerned. Kendall loved her son, but was beginning to see Dustin as more like a brother rather than her own little boy. Nora wanted to keep it that way. She didn't want Kendall to assume a maternal role in Dustin's life. There was only one problem that was beginning to rear its ugly head rather too frequently. Nora Trevelli was extremely attached to her grandson, like she'd been to her doll Cindy when she was a young girl. Kendall had realized from her fleeting visits to see her son that Nora considered herself to be Dustin's true mother, and that if she got in the way of Nora's child-rearing, there would be hell to pay. Kendall didn't really care about this turn of events. As far as she was concerned, there was plenty of time later on in life to have children. She was far too busy to be a mother, and she was quite happy to look on Dustin as a brother, and the adorable little boy had appropriately begun to call her Sis. It was when Dustin was approaching his 13th birthday that Nora planned the big move to the countryside. It wouldn't be far from Denver, but far enough to keep people away, and that was what was really needed. She was tired of people, teachers and friends alike, annoyingly lavishing so much praise and attention on her grandson. She knew to keep their interest at bay, she should move away, especially before Dustin became interested in girls, which was a thought she was seriously beginning to dread. Nora had decided to buy an enchanting cabin and give her grandson the horse he'd been requesting. She would get Dustin to do his studies from home, so that their contact with the outside world would become significantly reduced. Of course, they would go to church regularly, every Sunday, and shopping in the rural town. But beyond that, Nora would keep a careful and studious eye over her grandson, which in her opinion was greatly needed, the way things had been going. She certainly wanted to keep Dustin safely by her side, as long as she drew breath. Kiki, her best friend, had not been adverse to telling Nora her thoughts on the matter. She was now, like Nora, in her early 40s, and had 2 children, who were now in college, but she was still Nora's best friend. "I know why you're moving away, Nora, from Denver, and just so you know, I think it's a bad idea." Nora became defensive. "What are you talking about, Kiki? Who says I even care about what you think? I'm doing this for Dustin's sake. It's good for a young man to grow up close to nature, to learn the responsibility of taking care of his own horse. This adventure will do him the world of good." "I'm sure you're right about that, Nora. Learning to look after his own horse will do him good. And of course it's healthy to be surrounded by such beguiling views and crisp air. But—" Nora sighed, rolling her eyes in the back of her head, glaring defiantly at Kiki, who didn't appear to be remotely ruffled. "Go on, say it, Kiki. Whatever it is, get it off your chest, why don't you?" "You love Dustin. I get it, Nora. I really do. But you do know that one day he's going to grow up and leave home. He's 13 years old now, and you're messing his life up by deciding to move away. He's settled here. He's happy in Denver." "Your point is, Kiki?" This time it was Kiki who let out a sigh. She wasn't going to let Nora intimidate her. Some things needed to be said, and they needed to be spelt out. She needed to stick up for Dustin. The boy was growing up into a lovely young man, and Kiki had grown terribly fond of him over the years, so she had a right to express her misgivings. And now she really didn't care how Nora would react to them. "You want to move Dustin away from Denver. It makes no sense. As I was saying, he's happy here. He's well-rounded. You're moving into the middle of the sticks, and homeschooling him is a bad idea. I'm sorry, but it is. He hasn't been brought up that way, Nora. He doesn't know anything about homeschooling. Now you want to change his whole lifestyle. I'm sorry, but this is absolute madness." "There's nothing wrong with that, Kiki. A change of lifestyle never did anyone any harm." "Maybe not, Nora, but I worry that Dustin may later resent you from distancing him from his friends. He's been going to school since he was a little kid. Now you're taking him away from the life he knows and loves. I'm not sure long-term it's a great idea. Dustin is such a lovely boy. He's popular. The teachers at the local school love him so much. He's clever, great at sports. I myself have grown terribly fond of him over the years. You've done a sterling job in raising him, Nora. He belongs here in Denver, though. Tearing him away from the only life he's ever known is just not fair on him. You need to think about Dustin here. It's not all about you, Nora, and what you want. You have a child to consider in all of this." "Of course I know all that," snapped Nora. "I'm not a complete imbecile, Kiki." "I'm just saying. I'm worried you're getting attached to Dustin, Nora. Too attached. It's not healthy. You're quite possessive over him. When Dustin gets into his late teens, he won't be afraid to speak his mind out to you, Nora. And some of the things he might say won't be pretty. That's my bet. Don't be ridiculous, Kiki. You don't know what you're talking about. Nora moving away to a cabin in the middle of nowhere in the vain hope that you can distance Dustin from other people so that he stays with you indefinitely is not going to work long term. You do know that, don't you, Nora? Your Dustin is going to have ambitions. He's going to want to go to college one day, have kids of his own, finally get married. Nora raised her brow and said, I don't want Dustin to get married or to have children. I want him to stay with me in the cabin. And yes, if you must know, Kiki, that's exactly why we're moving. He'll soon realise that life is so very good with me. He'll never want to move away from his grandmother. The two of us are as thick as thieves, and that's the way it's going to stay, whether you like it or not, Kiki. Kiki shook her head sorrowfully. Nora, you know I love you, and I want what's best for you. You're making a big mistake, that's all I'm saying. You can't force the unnatural flow of life. It'll always dictate its own course. You have no control over it, you know, even if you think you do. Control is the one thing I have on my side, Kiki, I'll have you know. I have control over this whole thing. That's why I've planned it. Kiki inwardly squirmed. She knew that when Dustin got older, there would be significant problems. She could smell them on the wind. But her best friend's dogged refusal to listen to her sagacious advice would one day come back to haunt her. Of that Kiki was most sure. Dustin, I was 13 years old when Granny Nora insisted we move to the Colorado countryside, far away from our home in Denver, well, reasonably far away, to live in a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere, where she'd homeschool me. I don't want to go and live in a funny cabin somewhere. I want to stay here in Denver. I've got lots of friends here, haven't I? It'll be so boring living in a cabin. Besides, I've never been homeschooled before, Granny, I had protested. I really like going to school in Denver, being around my friends. I know all that, Dustin, and I understand where you're coming from. Believe me, I do. You may think you have a life that is good here in Denver, and I agree to an extent you do. But you're going to have it so much better where we're going. You're going to thoroughly enjoy a much greater freedom and independence, something that all your schoolmates will surely envy. Most school children hate to endure the laborious, long-drawn-out monotony of a daily school day. I know I did when I was your age. I was always rebelling against school. I'd have been thrilled to death if my life had offered me so much more freedom. Why do you think so many children around the world play truant? They hate going to school and being subjected to all those dreadfully strict rules. You're going to absolutely love it where we're going. In truth, you're going to have the very best of both worlds, aren't you? You'll be able to come up to Denver to see your friends whenever you like. You can catch up with their news and so forth. We can come here as often as you want, and that's a promise, so you will not miss out on a single thing, will you? I'll give you my word on that. But why do you want to move away, Granny Nora? I just don't get it. I told you I don't want to go far away from Denver. I don't mind going away on holidays because we always go back home afterwards. I really like living here in Denver. I don't want to move. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, Dustin. Really, I am. If you don't want us to leave Denver, we won't. But I fear you'll be missing out so very much. What do you mean? I asked. Well, I was going to keep it as a surprise, but I might as well tell you my plans. I was going to buy you a couple of horses that you could take care of yourself. Imagine that, Dustin. I know how much you love visiting the stables over the weekends to go horse riding. But none of those horses you ride belong to you, do they? They belong to the stables. Imagine owning your very own horse that you can personally take care of. We can get a couple of black Labradors and chickens and anything else you fancy besides. Anyway, you've always loved horses, haven't you? Imagine all the lovely riding you can do. You'll have the time of your life, going riding whenever you so wish, without being cruelly dictated to by an authoritative school curriculum that orders all the shots of your day. You can do as you please and fit in your studies when it suits you. It's a win-win situation, and I wouldn't mind betting most children would happily trade places with you any day of the week. You mean if we move, I can have my own horse? I asked, my eyes widening in delight at the prospect of owning a horse. I could see myself riding on its back, down intrepid horse-riding trails, me and my horse against the entire world. That's exactly what I mean, Dustin. I know how much horses mean to you. I'll get a stable block built for us and a little barn, and you can manage it all. It'll be your responsibility. And when I die, the cabin, the land, and everything else besides will be yours. I'll buy you a mountain bike, an ATV. You'll have all the quintessential accessories you love. I'll even buy you your own truck when you're ready to get your license. What do you think about that? You're going to get me horses, I said, articulating the word in the open air, as if tasting its meaning on my tongue. My heart began to flutter wildly in my chest. My grandmother knew I loved horses. I had posters of horses all over my wall. Horses that had won the Grand National and other illustrious championships. I regularly went for horse riding lessons every weekend. My riding teacher, Rachel Munro, described me as a natural. I had won a line of rosettes in horse riding competitions, and these trophies were displayed in pride of place on my mantel. The thought of owning my own horse, that I was completely responsible for taking care of, tickled me pink, and changed the complete trajectory of my focus. Suddenly the idea of staying in Denver and going to school every day, under a drudgerously boring, restrictive daily routine, lost its glossy appeal. If I was living in a remote cabin with my grandmother, swaddled by the countryside, waking up to prepossessing views over the Colorado mountains every single day, what in the world could be better than that? I could spend hours with my horses, mucking out stables, going out on rides whenever I wanted. My grandmother would come on some of those rides with me, given she was a keen rider, and I knew the two of us could have so much fun together. I loved my grandmother with all my heart, as she had devoted her entire life to taking care of me, and I appreciated everything she had done, as growing up she had been my greatest cheerleader, who had denied me nothing, and if she believed the move was in our best interests, I wanted to grab this opportunity greedily with both of my hands. My mother Kendall had been a mere teenager when she had given birth to me. I considered Kendall more like a big sister to me than a mother. Without doubt, Granny Nora was the matriarch figure in my life, and was like a mother and grandmother rolled into one for me. She naturally influenced my decisions and the directions I took in my life. I always valued her instruction. She was far wiser than me. She had been successful at a very young age and retired early, while incurring a monthly income from all her investments. She had done something right in her life, and how many people can boast of such accomplishments? So listening to her sound advice was always a good idea. I knew moving to the countryside would mean I'd be able to embrace my studies to a schedule that conveniently suited me. My grandmother had promised me that she would teach me everything I would need to know. Beyond that, we could visit Denver regularly to catch up with my friends and family, so my resistance towards the move became rather thin. Of course, it goes without saying that I knew I would be sad to leave Denver and all my friends, but I had high hopes about the promising future that awaited me, like a bright sunrise spilled generously over the horizon in a splash of cheerful, engaging colours. The first time I happened to lay eyes on the perfectly enchanting wooden cabin that was 50 years old, that was called appropriately by the name Old Glen, as it had been owned by a hunting and fishing enthusiast, known by his friends as Old Glen, hence the name of the cabin. I understood Old Glen was a bit of a recluse, who thoroughly enjoyed spending copious amounts of time on his own, exploring the great outdoors. He lived to the grand old age of 105. Old Glen had claimed that his robust good health, came from living a stress-free life. People always ask me my secret to living so long. They think it's all about my diet. It has nothing to do with my diet. It's not what you eat, you know, he would say to his friends. It's what is eating you. That's what really matters. If you want to live a long life, you need to abandon worry, live in the moment. And out here, that's exactly what I do. Old Glenn had initially bought the sprawling property, where he had attentively built the cabin himself, with the help of his brother Max. Old Glenn was a Denver native, and he fancied staying in the cabin on his own for extended periods of time, and he knew his cabin would likely need to accommodate his extended family members, should they wish to visit him for the occasional long weekend. Indeed, many family Thanksgivings and Christmases had been spent at Old Glenn's cabin, as the family had thoroughly enjoyed spending their spare time idyllically swaddled by the Colorado countryside, and the company of Old Glenn, who was a lovable character. As a consequence, Old Glenn had paid attention to the layout of the cabin when he first constructed it, so it looked a little like a quaint gingerbread house that was rather easy on the eye, and certainly sizable enough to accommodate an entire family. If he had built it only for himself, which was the initial plan, it would have been very basic, small and rudimentary. But Old Glenn wanted to encourage his family members to stay here as often as possible. The cabin was the kind of place you'd be eager to stay in. It was cosy and welcoming, and Old Glenn was a sociable character. I could easily see why his family had adored coming here. It made you feel as if you were permanently on vacation, a place where you could easily forget about the daily responsibilities of life, or the grueling work you were expected to do when you got back to the office the following week. My grandmother, Nora Trevelli, had learnt that Old Glenn's family had been hesitant and reluctant to part with the cabin that had belonged to Old Glenn. But my grandmother had fallen head over heels in love with the place. She succeeded in persuading the family to sell it to her by offering them a price that they could not refuse. Had I been wearing their shoes, I would never have sold Old Glenn's cabin. It occupied a piece of land that was nothing short of idyllic. My grandmother had excelled herself in buying this property. I was going to absolutely love it here, and I knew that without a shadow of doubt. When I first laid eyes on the mountains that dominated the skyline, the last thing I even thought about was my school, or even my friends in Denver, or my old life. Indeed, I was so delighted to be here in this neck of the woods that I was purring like a satisfied, very contented domestic tabby cat, who stuffed himself rigid with Thanksgiving dinner, and is happily digesting the rich bounty he's ingested, while wallowing lackadaisically in the sweet sunshine. That was what it was like out here. Even the crisp air was so rich, it was rather like eating a decadent fruit cake, and savouring all the lovely flavours. The cabin was nothing like I'd ever envisaged it would be. Certainly my grandmother, Nora Trevelli, had told me that one day I would inherit it all. Such a pleasing thought filled me with great joy. The place was beyond breathtakingly beautiful. I could never have imagined living anywhere else in the world as lovely as this. I glanced up in the blue sky and observed two masterful eagles soaring into the heavens above my head, with their imperial outstretched wings, and I was struck by my good fortune. Old Glenn was happily nestled against the prepossessing backdrop of the Colorado mountains, peppered with beautiful alpine flowers that thrust their bright little inquiring heads inquisitively over the lower expanse of the mountains, while the peaks themselves dipped their noses into the snow. Sometimes rather bashfully, the tips hid their voluptuous contours behind the cloud cover, like a woman in a state of undress, concealing her modesty behind a closet door. The property eagerly boasted sprawling groves of trees. There were streams of fast-moving water that snaked through the woods and ran through neighbouring properties. Certainly the property my grandmother had bought was sizable enough, but there were conveniently accessible back roads that led to a plethora of intrepid horse-riding trails that were open to the public and that I meant to explore myself. My grandmother had dutifully lived up to her promises, so that the Old Glenn property was kitted out with stables and outbuildings. She had also allowed me to purchase 2 American quarterback horses that I was privy to choosing myself. One of the horses was called Fleming, who was the male horse, and the female horse was called Chariot. The moment I laid my eyes on Fleming, it was love at first sight. I had an immediate connection with that horse, for reasons I cannot explain. Fleming had trotted over to me when I first met him. It was like there was this telepathic exchange that occurred between the two of us, almost as if we knew that we belonged together, as weird as that may sound to you. Fleming did not seem to be remotely surprised when he was transported to his new home. It was like he took one look at the old Glen property and was saying, "I'm home at last." I knew moving to the cabin was the best thing that could have happened to me. I could spend many hours on Fleming's back, getting to know him better. My grandmother considered Chariot to be her horse, and began to ride her regularly. We also got 2 rambunctious black Labradors called Dover and Pepsi, as well as a plethora of chickens, which also managed to worm their way into my heart. I ended up giving them all names, which my grandmother said was not a great idea, because if one of them died, I would be grievously upset. But as far as I was concerned, everything that lived on the old Glen property deserved a name. My grandmother started growing vegetable beds. I helped her with managing this kitchen garden. So yes, there were many positive moves to living so close to nature and eating the fresh food that nature herself provided. It was so satisfying growing your own stuff, and we were healthier because of it. In the beginning it felt as if we were both on vacation, until I soon began to realize the cabin really was my new home. I had to pinch myself sometimes to remind myself of that. It was a comfortable space, as my grandmother had kitted it out so superbly. It boasted fireplaces, wood-burning stoves, and sumptuous furnishings that made the place so much more comfortable for the both of us. My bedroom was a lot better than my room in Denver. It was kitted out with a king-size bed that Grandma Nora insisted that I needed because I was getting significantly bigger. I had framed pictures of me riding on the back of Fleming that my grandmother had taken and subsequently framed. So yes, I was beginning to thoroughly enjoy my brand new life. When I was not out of doors with the horses, dogs and chickens, then I was lightly in my bedroom listening to music or contacting friends of mine in Denver, with a rather precarious internet connection that was often playing truant with me. I did of course miss my friends, especially my best friend Thomas Barker, but my grandmother had assured me that Thomas could come and stay with us in due course. It was with time I began to realize how isolated me and my grandmother had ultimately become. We went to church every Sunday, of course, and occasionally shopping in the local town. And while I tried to keep in touch with my friends in Denver, with the passing of time I became increasingly apathetic towards them. My attention these days was devoted towards my horses, and any opportunity I could get to ride them. I would be out there, on horseback, riding through the groves of trees, down intrepid horse-riding trails, without a single care in the entire world. And I will not kid, there was no better feeling in the world, and I felt so free. One day me and my grandmother decided to go riding through the woods on our property. The woods met a back road that led down a public horse-riding trail. It was a route we commonly took together, but we had no way of knowing that this would be a horseback ride we would be unlikely to forget. And for days afterwards my grandmother would dab her head with a handkerchief and say, "Goodness gracious me, did that really happen, Dustin, or did I dream it all?" I would say to her, "Granny Nora, it happened." "But I don't understand," she would say. "Are those things really real?" But we both knew that they were. I'm not sure what day it was, as when you're living in a sequestered cabin in the middle of nowhere, so to speak, you kind of lose track as to what day of the week it actually is. You don't even care about that anyway. And even your sense of time can go very badly awry. So you're guided by the rising and setting of the sun to glean what time of the day it actually is. Sometimes when we took the public riding trail, we would occasionally encounter locals in the area who were riding ATVs, mountain bikes or horses. It was a stunning morning as we rode our 2 horses down the well-known horse-riding trail. We laughed as we did so. Our black Labrador dogs were wagging their tails profusely and sniffing the ground, on the trail of ascent, I suspect. I do remember it was late autumn. The trees painted the countryside in a glorious rich ensemble of reds and golds. The morning light that gently whispered through the trees covered everything in a spray of glitter. At one point we went up a hilly incline, where there was a steep, significant drop that you would do well to avoid, for if you were to fall down it, you might find yourself landing up in heaps of trouble. Our 2 Labradors began running at our side. The horses trotted forward along the path, and that was when we saw her. Nothing prepared us for such an outlandish, spectacularly peculiar encounter. On seeing her, the horses froze instantaneously. They refused to move forward even an inch. They abruptly came to a very swift standstill, while our 2 black Labrador dogs began to bark somewhat frantically, for they did not know what to make of this tall, dark, shadowy silhouette that stood before us. I think for all of us we were taken off guard, and for a moment I was so speechless I thought I'd been flung into a dream. This could not be real, could it? The humanoid creature that stood before us swung her overlong arms in a gesture that suggested she was indicating for us to stop, but we had already done so. She was larger than life, absolutely enormous, tall and lofty, generously covered in long flowing dark hair, the colour of coffee beans. She blocked the path ahead of us intentionally, as if she didn't want us to proceed any further, for reasons I couldn't fathom or comprehend. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, we were observing a female Bigfoot. Her feminine presence and small breasts indicated she was distinctly female. I knew unequivocally that my eyes were not deceiving me, even though I almost wished that they were. I do not know why the horses were not kicking the ground and bucking so that they could get away from this outlandish creature as quickly as they could, or why our 2 black Labrador dogs ceased barking. They became serene and rather mute. It was like in the blink of an eye everything became quiet, as if we'd all been suddenly injected with a tranquilizer that was calming down our base instincts, which might have told us to get the hell away from this absurd-looking creature. I assure you this female Bigfoot was probably the most intimidating creature I have ever beheld. She was gargantuan, ponderous shoulders, overlong arms, and an extremely ripped torso that would definitely be the envy of any aspiring bodybuilder, for she would have made the world's strongest man look puny and weak. I was surprised how calm I suddenly felt, almost as if I had been flooded with what I can only describe as feel-good endorphins, like dopamine and serotonin. Even my dogs appeared to begin to wag their tails, looking up at the Bigfoot as if she no longer imposed a threat to them, but was a familiar, much-loved member of our family. It was almost as if the Bigfoot had locked us under some kind of spellbinding, feel-good-like trance that flooded us with euphoria, casting away loathsome fears, doubts, and insecurities. In the beginning of this absurd encounter, while I was pondering what I was seeing, I do remember my heartbeat on seeing her became frantic. It drummed through my chest at 100 miles an hour, but then miraculously it slowed down. Everything became peaceful and calm. It was like my fear had galloped away from me. Everything was still, as me and my grandmother sat stoically on the back of our unflinching, well-behaved horses, just looking at this Bigfoot, who seemed to have a message to convey to us, as if she wanted our undivided attention. I found myself being drawn to looking into her eyes, even though I didn't want to. She kept pointing at her eyes, practically begging us to look into them. I did want to look away. I was worried she would hypnotize me, but I felt as if I was being pulled into her eyes, being dragged down a long, dark, mysterious vortex against my will. As I looked into the Bigfoot's eyes, I was seeing flashing images going off in my head. She appeared to be showing me something that had happened only moments before, and was communicating to us telepathically, as odd as that may sound to you. In the imagery that she projected towards me, I observed a man on an ATV, falling down the steep incline in the woods, the very incline we were on right now. The man lost control on his ATV and descended down the deep drop, and I could see him falling and struggling to get back on his feet again, while wincing in pain. After the Bigfoot had fed our minds this imagery, she proceeded to point down the ravine. I had a sense she wanted us to help this man, who was obviously in trouble. She then turned around and vanished through the trees and was gone. Once she left our side, it was almost as if nothing had happened. The dogs and the horses began behaving normally again. "My God!" said my grandmother. "Did that just happen? Did we just see a female Bigfoot?" "We sure did," I said. "Did you see those pictures in your head that she communicated to us about the man on the ATV?" "I sure did," I said, climbing down my horse. "Wait there," I said to my grandmother. "Don't move an inch. Someone's clearly in trouble. They obviously need our help. That's what the Bigfoot was communicating to us. They must have fallen down this incline while riding their ATV. It is an accident waiting to happen, if you don't know where you're going, that is." "Oh, for goodness sake, Dustin, get a grip, will you? Get back onto your horse, will you? If someone's fallen down the incline, it's hardly our problem, is it?" I looked at my grandmother aghast. Had she really just said that? Did she not care that someone could potentially be in big trouble? "Of course we have to help someone, Granny, if they've fallen down this incline. They could be badly hurt, couldn't they? You saw the Bigfoot, didn't you, Granny? She told us somebody needs our help. She genuinely seemed to care about their welfare, and so should we." That was when I distinctly heard a man's voice. He was calling out for help. He must have sensed our presence and heard our Labradors barking. "Hello? Hello? Can anybody hear me? Can anybody hear me? I'm stuck. I've fallen down the steep ravine. Can somebody help me, please? I'm having a bit of a trouble getting up. I've hurt my ankles very badly. Can anybody hear me? I'm in trouble." "I can hear you. Don't worry, just stay where you are. I'm coming now," I said. I wasted no time in getting to the man as quickly as I could. I grabbed tree branches and shrubbery to haul myself rather gingerly down the steep dip in the ground. My dogs promptly darted down the hill with relative ease, putting my futile, rather feeble attempts to shame, making me feel like an ungainly old man. I could see some tree branches were broken. There were stumps all over the place, and an ATV was lying haphazardly among some foliage upside down, having caused quite a lot of damage in its descent. I was relieved that it was crushing foliage and not a human body beneath its heavy wheels. The accidents could have been a whole lot worse, potentially even deadly. Further down the incline, I was relieved to see the man sitting on the ground, his legs stretched out before him, his chinos rolled up above his ankles. He appeared to be wincing in pain. At a guess, he was around about my grandmother's age, but he had twisted both his ankles badly. It was impossible for him to walk, as I could see the tissue around his ankles was badly swollen. The man's kind blue eyes expressed great relief in seeing me. "Are you all right, sir?" I asked the man, rushing to his side. "Oh, thank goodness you came," said the man. "I'm so relieved. I heard your horses and dogs. I had dreadful visions of myself being trapped here all night. My name's Michael Drewberry. I don't live far away from here. And you are. You must forgive me, but I don't recognize you, son. You must be relatively new to this area." "My name is Dustin. Are you all right, sir? I was very worried about you when I heard you call out." I knew the man had taken a tumble, but beyond that he seemed to be in relatively good shape and in good humour. "I'm all right, son. Well, at least from the ankles up I am. I'm sure I shall live. I don't think I've broken anything, so that's the good news. I think I sprained both ankles at the same time. Imagine that. 2 sprains on both legs. The pain is absolutely excruciating, as you can imagine." "So that means you can't stand up, sir?" "Not a chance in hell, young man. Not a chance." I bent down to examine the man's ankles more closely. He winced in pain as I touched him. "Well, you're right, sir. I don't think you've broken anything. but I do know from personal experience how painful a twisted ankle can be, and you've got 2 of them. I'll get you help, sir. I will be most obliged. Thank you very much, Dustin. I was incredibly glad that eventually, after calling for help, that Michael Drewbury was rescued and taken to hospital. He was soon given the all clear by the doctors. It was affirmed that he had not broken anything, which was a huge relief. Me and my grandmother went to visit him in hospital together. After Michael laid eyes on my grandmother for the first time, he fell for her hard. I was to learn he'd tragically lost his own wife to cancer a few years earlier and missed her terribly. After Michael had made a full recovery from his twisted ankles, he became a regular visitor to our cabin, dropping in on us spontaneously, not only to express his gratitude that we'd rescued him from his nasty accident, but to say hello. It didn't take a rocket scientist to see that Michael Drewbury really liked my grandmother. I don't know what I would have done without the 2 of you, if you hadn't rescued me, he would say over and over again like a broken record. The 2 of you definitely saved my life. Don't be ridiculous, Michael, my grandmother would say. You'd have done just fine once the pain in your ankle subsided. Then you'd have managed to climb right back up to the trail and get help, I'm most sure. I could see my grandmother Nora was getting increasingly annoyed with Michael's regular visits to our cabin, although she hid it well. I did privately wonder why she was so adverse to this very nice man, whose only crime was showing my grandmother a keen interest, and what was wrong with that? Michael would bring my grandmother chocolates and flowers, so there was no denying that he was spelling out to my grandmother, in unwritten words, how much he genuinely liked her. My grandmother did not take his overtures kindly, but seemed to brush them off contemptuously, like fleas on a dog's coat. I could not help but clandestinely wonder if my grandmother was rejecting this gentleman's advances on my account. I didn't want her to sacrifice herself because she was raising me. I thought it would be healthy for her to have a romantic relationship with a nice man like Michael. I did my very best to encourage my grandmother to get involved with him. I thought it would do her the world of good, and besides I genuinely liked the man, and if he ended up living with us it would be pretty cool. It would be rather nice to have a man around the place, I thought. I'd never had a father, so a male presence around our home would be greatly appreciated. What is wrong, Granny? I teased. Michael Drewbury is such a lovely gentleman, and he genuinely likes you, Granny, very much. You could do a whole lot worse. He's good-looking, charming, he's got a great sense of humour. What is there not to like about him? Oh, please, love, listen to yourself, Dustin, said my grandmother, rolling her eyes in the back of her head in exasperation. Do I look like I want a relationship with a man? Absolutely not. It's more trouble than it's worth, believe me, I know. Besides, I really don't want to get involved with anyone at this stage of my life. It complicates things, does it not? I don't see why it should complicate anything. It's simple. The man likes you. It was after Michael Drewbury had paid us a visit and asked my grandmother out on a date that she had declined, that I noticed a change in my grandmother's demeanour. She seemed very annoyed. I remember my grandmother saying, "Why won't that wretched man get the bloody message? Is he dim or something? I've had enough of Michael. He keeps popping around here, and it's driving me insane." "Because he likes you, Granny, that's why. What's wrong with that? I keep telling you, he's a gentleman." "He needs to go. I am done with that man." My grandmother said this with her eyes blazing. I'd never seen her look so mad. I thought nothing more of the matter, or about my grandmother's ominous words. I thought she'd probably be very blunt with Michael Drewbury next time when she saw him, and like a normal person politely let him down by telling him she wasn't interested in a relationship with him. What I failed to realize at the time was that there was nothing normal about my grandmother. In truth, I felt sorry for Michael Drewbury. He was such a genuine guy. It was rather unfortunate for my grandmother to be alone when she was reasonably young, and I thought a relationship with Michael would have been good for her, but she seemed to disagree on that. As far as I was concerned, Michael was a catch. But my grandmother failed to see that. Imagine my immense surprise when Michael Drewbury arrived at our cabin the following day, with expectation written all over his face, as if he was picking my grandmother up for a date. It turned out he was. I could hardly believe it. This was a turnaround for the books. It was something I'd never seen coming, especially after my grandmother's indignant words about Michael had been fully expressed. And yet now here she was going out on a date with him. Maybe she had listened to me after all. I felt really happy for her. I really believed Michael Drewbury would be good for her. Once I left home when I got older, it would be pleasing to know that she had a companion, as no one wants to be alone indefinitely. Maybe my grandmother had reconsidered all of this. I understood she had taken the initiative and actually given Michael a call to arrange the date herself. Michael Drewbury was seated on the back of his ATV, waiting patiently for my grandmother to make her appearance. "Hello, Michael," I said, standing at the front door of Old Glen, and watching Michael parking his ATV on the driveway, yards away from where I happened to be standing. I could see Michael looked rather flustered, as if he was bubbling over with excitement, and he normally managed to keep his feelings in check, so this behaviour was rather unusual for him. "For what do we owe this pleasure, Michael? Why have you come to visit us in your ATV? Where is your truck?" "Oh, hello there, Dustin. Good to see you, son. If you must know, I'm taking your grandmother Nora for a ride on my ATV. So the truck's parked at home. I aim to please, and if this is what the lady wants, this is what the lady gets. You can tell your beautiful grandmother her carriage is awaiting her, and that her Prince Charming has arrived." I grinned at Michael broadly, like a Cheshire cat, and went indoors to call my grandmother. I was to learn that my grandmother had requested an ATV ride to the public hiking trail where Michael had last had his accident. I couldn't believe it. I did wonder if it was wise for Michael to repeat the same trip all over again, given what had happened last time he went out on his ATV to that particular neck of the woods, and I wasn't afraid to express my misgivings in the matter. "Michael, I don't want to be a wet blanket, I really don't. But last time you had that accident on your ATV, on the very same hiking trail. Why don't you go somewhere a lot less hilly? I don't think it's wise to go back on that trail again. The paths are very steep there. I'd hate you to have another accident." "Goodness gracious, young man. You're sounding like my mother. I overcorrected my ATV on that hiking trail. I miscalculated the turn in the path, and I hit the accelerator instead of the brakes. It was a multitude of errors occurring at the same time. It's not going to happen again." "I hope not, Michael, because Granny is going with you, and I don't want her to come to any harm." "Don't you worry," Michael chuckled. "Your grandmother wants to go on an intrepid adventure to her favourite hiking trail, and I'm not about to refuse her anything. Don't you worry, I will be careful. I'm going to show her a very good time," he said, giving me a wink. "And I'm going to take good care of her, son." "Well, as long as you're careful." My grandmother came out of the cabin to greet Michael Drewbury. She had a huge smile on her face. She was behaving flirtatiously and wearing bright red lipstick on her lips, a wide-brimmed straw hat on her head, and carrying a large bag over her shoulders, which she claimed contained snacks for their trip. "Oh, there you are, Michael," she said coquettishly, flashing her eyelashes at him. "I've been looking forward to this adventure of ours. I thought you'd never get here." "Your carriage awaits," said Michael, pointing to the seat next to him on the ATV. "You look very beautiful today, Nora, if you don't mind my saying so. But then again, you always look beautiful." My grandmother laughed. "Oh, please, Michael, you're embarrassing me. But it's very kind of you to say. You don't look half so handsome yourself." I realised that maybe Granny Nora really did fancy Michael rotten. Maybe she was warming to the man after all, and her insistence that she didn't want to see him again had all been but a ruse, as deep down I gleaned she must really, really like him, and I suddenly felt very happy for the both of them. I thought they made a great couple. When my grandmother approached the ATV, she brushed her hand on Michael's shoulders affectionately. I was flabbergasted. My grandmother did not do open displays of affection, but Michael Drewbury was grinning from ear to ear, like a little boy who'd been given a train set for Christmas. His face had grown as red as a field of poppies as he blushed. His eyes sparkled, and he seemed to become suddenly rather bashful, like the shy boy in the classroom that has a huge crush over the teacher. "Oh, Michael, before you go, do you mind if I ask you a question?" "Ask away, son. You can ask me anything you like." "Well, I just don't understand how you managed to recover your ATV from that big drop." "It's funny you should ask such a question," said Michael, shaking his shoulders. "I don't know the answer to it myself. My ATV was mysteriously recovered back on the earthen trail. I don't know how it got back there. The thing is so heavy, I have no idea who lifted it. But I am very pleased to have it back." The only thought that cruised into my head was that the Bigfoot we'd encountered that day, who had informed me and my grandmother about Michael's unfortunate accident, had lightly retrieved the ATV from the steep drop and probably carried it straight up to the path so that Michael would recover it again. It was the only fitting explanation that made any sense, and it was a miracle that the ATV was in one piece. I watched my grandmother chuckling away as she and Michael Drewbury sped away on the back of the ATV. I grinned to myself and shook my head as I marvelled how life was so full of wonderful surprises. I had no way of knowing that this would be the last time I would ever lay eyes on Michael Drewbury alive again. It was my grandmother who returned on Michael's ATV later that morning without the man by her side. "Where's Michael?" I asked my grandmother. "I don't know the answer to that question," said my grandmother. "I have absolutely no idea where the man has got to. I must call the police at once. I think something quite terrible has happened to him. I've got an awful feeling about this." "What do you mean?" I asked, confounded. "Why would you say such a thing? Where is he?" "Oh, you know," said my grandmother, "it was just too dreadful, it really was. Michael stopped the ATV and went to take a leak behind a tree. Goodness gracious, the man has got such a weak bladder. I mean, we barely left and he needed to go to the loo almost at once. Well, I heard a loud, thunderous noise and a scream, and then he just vanished, disappeared. I couldn't find him anywhere. But something happened to him in the undergrowth." "What, you heard a scream, did you, Granny?" I asked. "Michael screamed, is that what you're saying? You think something attacked him?" "Oh, yes, I do. I'm in no doubt about it. I began to panic. I called out Michael's name, but there was no response. I couldn't find him anywhere. Something attacked him in those trees behind the shrubbery. I think it might have been the Bigfoot we saw. Do you remember the Bigfoot we saw?" "No, the Bigfoot wouldn't have done that," I said, shaking my head indignantly, as I wrestled with my grandmother's unfortunate words. "That Bigfoot saved Michael's life, don't you remember? She'd never have harmed him. She'd have more likely helped him. He must have encountered something else on the trail. Or maybe he screamed because he hurt himself. Maybe he walked into an old trap." "You never know," said my grandmother. "I'm just very worried about Michael. I think he may have come to some grievous harm. I really do." My grandmother told the police what she'd told me, and they were practically eating out of her hands. "Oh, it was just so dreadful," she said, tears spilling down her face. "Detective, I fear something quite dreadful has happened to Michael Drewbury. You have no idea what it was like for me, being on the ATV and then hearing that scream. Oh, I am still having palpitations from the experience." I'd never seen my grandmother upset like this before. She actually began to bawl her eyes out in front of the detective, who clearly believed my grandmother was absolutely distraught. I didn't know what to think about the matter. I'd never seen my grandmother behave like this before. I felt almost as if I'd been swept on the stage of a theatre, as I really didn't believe for a single moment my grandmother had been that enamoured by Michael Drewbury. although this morning she had certainly been rather flirtatious towards him. The detective appeared very sympathetic, and he tried to reassure my grandmother. "Don't you worry. We are going to search the hiking trail thoroughly, ma'am, and we shall find Michael Drewbury. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for why he's gone missing." "Oh, I hope you're right, detective, because that scream is still drilling through me right now, even when I think about it. I fear something quite calamitous has happened to him." The police did recover Michael Drewbury's body. You can bet your bottom dollar about that. But they did not find the man alive. The coroner said he'd been bludgeoned to death by a hammer that had been used on the back of his head. The strangest part of it all was that both his eyes had been gouged out with a medical precision. But no one knew how this could have come to pass. My grandmother kept telling the detective that we'd seen a Bigfoot in the woods once, and she was certain it was this creature that must have killed Michael Drewbury. But the detective clearly did not believe that Bigfoots even existed. It seemed that the detective took my grandmother's testimony about her Bigfoot encounter with a scant regard, and didn't believe a word of it. "Ma'am, I'm afraid, ma'am, I hate to say this to you, but someone intentionally meant to harm your boyfriend. I think that when he took a leak and went behind the shrubbery, that someone pounced on him unaware and caused him grievous harm." "Oh, it's just too dreadful to hear you say that, detective. I can't believe that anybody would want to harm such a wonderfully kind man like Michael. The world is a lesser place without him in it. I just despair." "So do you know anybody that might want to harm him, ma'am?" "I can't think of anybody, because everybody loved the man. He was so kind. But I do know he had a rather unfortunate relationship with his brother Clint." It would seem Michael Drewbury did indeed have a very fractious relationship with his brother Clint. But Clint had an alibi for the day that Michael Drewbury's life came to a very unfortunate fortuitous end. The police had put him high on the suspect list nevertheless, as there was no love lost between the two brothers. Much like the detective, it never crossed my mind that my grandmother Nora would have anything to do with this insidious crime. I would often ponder to myself as to who could have wished to harm such a delightful man like Michael Drewbury. It would seem my grandmother's sadness over his death dissipated the moment the police left the cabin after their questioning. I did wonder what really happened on that ATV ride through the trees, but I didn't believe for a single second that a Bigfoot had harmed Michael Drewbury. And although my grandmother insisted that that is what happened, I never believed it for a moment. Clara's account, 5 years later. "You're really going to love my grandmother," Dustin told me. "Wait until you meet her. I think she's going to love you. You've been my best-kept secret, Clara, for the last 6 months. I only told my grandmother about you yesterday, so it came as quite a surprise to her. But I needed to be absolutely sure where our relationship was going before I introduced you to her, or told her about you. You see, my grandmother is very protective over me. I've only ever lived with her all my life, and I've never brought a girl back home to the cabin before. You're the very first." I looked at Dustin aghast. "You mean that all the while we've been dating, that you've never mentioned me to your grandmother before? She doesn't know about me. You're not ashamed of me, are you, Dustin?" Dustin flushed. He grew red with embarrassment. He reached out to squeeze my hand reassuringly. "Ashamed of you, Clara? Are you kidding? You're the best thing that has ever happened to me. Of course I'm not ashamed of you. Where would you get such a preposterous idea from? I like you a lot. Well, that's actually an understatement. I really, really like you. Please don't be mad with me. I just find it rather difficult to talk to my grandmother about personal stuff. She's a very reserved woman, you know. I did happen to tell her I'd accepted a job with your father to help him look after his horses. She was very pleased about it, but I failed to mention that your father had a beautiful daughter, and that was the real reason that I was working for him." I raised my brow. "You do surprise me, Dustin. So you're telling me your grandmother doesn't know a thing about us? I'm surprised she hasn't guessed. What about some of the late nights we've enjoyed together? Surely she must smell a rat." "My grandmother could sleep through a hurricane, and I'm not kidding about that either. So when I've slipped out late at night to meet you, she's long since retired to bed. She often listens to audiobooks with her headphones on, so I suspect she doesn't hear a thing." "So what did she do when you told her about us? What did she say?" "Well, it was hard to gauge her reaction, really," Dustin admitted. "At first she seemed to go quite pale. Then she chuckled and said, 'So you've been seeing someone, have you, Dustin? You really are a dark horse, aren't you? You didn't think to tell your grandmother about this? Who is she, Dustin?' I told her, 'She's the most beautiful girl I've ever met, Granny.' I told her I liked you a lot and that I was serious about you." "And what did she say about that?" Dustin shrugged awkwardly. "Well, she wasn't that impressed, I have to admit. She said I was young and impressionable, and that we were both still young and naive. But even so, she said she's looking forward to meeting you." "Lovely! Is that what she said? It doesn't exactly inspire me with any confidence, Dustin." "Don't be like that, Clara. That's my grandmother for you. You can't blame her for being a perennial cynic. After all, she's never been married. I think she's rather scathing about love." "But surely she's had boyfriends in the past. After all, she gave birth to your mother Kendall, didn't she? So she must have been intimate with a man before." "My grandmother has always been an attractive woman. Men have always been interested in her. But she hasn't responded in kind, so to speak. And as for boyfriends, she hasn't had any. The only time she came close to dating anyone was when she met a man called Michael Drewbury. He lived in a neighbouring farm from us. He showed a great deal of interest in her. She wasn't exactly enamoured with him in the beginning, but I think he worked his magic on her, because she finally agreed to go on a date with him on his ATV in the Woodgrove. He went and took a leak. She heard a strange scream coming from him, and then he vanished. Later the police found his body. His eyes had been gouged out. It looked like his head had been whacked with a hammer. I guess after that my grandmother was sworn off dating men for good. Having a date like that is not going to make you keen on going out with anybody else, is it?" "But that's terrible, Dustin. You never told me about this." "Well, it's not something I like to talk about. It's desperately sad, you see. Michael Drewbury was a very, very nice man. My grandmother was lucky to go out with him. I think they would have been a great couple. So what happened to him doesn't bear talking about." "What did the police do about it?" "Nothing, really. The case is still open, but there are no new leads in the investigation as to what had actually happened to Michael Drewbury. I do know his brother was a suspect for quite some time." I was rather apprehensive about meeting Dustin's grandmother, Nora. She clearly had a dim view of relationships, as she herself had never been married, even though Dustin informed me that she had not been short of male admirers. She had always been and still remained a good-looking woman, who had made her fortune from a young age, and as a result had supported Dustin on the income generated from her investments. I wondered why such a woman had never married before. But from what Dustin had told me about his grandmother, I had a nasty inkling in my gut that my boyfriend's grandmother would not like me making an abrupt, unwelcome appearance into their lives. If that woman had diligently homeschooled Dustin from the age of 13 onwards, and fulfilled the role of being a matriarch figure for him in his life, I was certain she might find me to be an interference in their lives that she could well do without. She might be particularly possessive of her grandson, as they had lived together alone for so many years, without any interference from outside parties. I was a little annoyed that Dustin had not told her all about me a long time ago, as it could have eased the pathway a little to make her accept the idea of me. I was the first girl he was bringing home to meet her, and that was not a good feeling for me. What if she didn't like me? What if Dustin cared so much about his grandmother's opinion of me that if she told him that she didn't like me at all, he might brush me away like the dog hairs on a coat. I had invested a lot in this relationship with Dustin. I had never felt this way about a boy before. I may have been young and naive, but I still knew a good thing when I saw it, and Dustin was the best thing that had ever happened to me. I was rather nervous when Dustin parked his car outside the cabin. "This is it," he said. "This is old Glen, the cabin I've been telling you all about." He looked at me kindly and squeezed my hand affectionately. "Please don't panic, Clara. Look at you. You're as white as a sheet. It's going to be all right. You're being nervous about nothing. My grandmother's not going to bite you. I told you she's looking forward to meeting you." "Why is it, Dustin, that I doubt that very much?" I gritted my teeth and took in a deep breath. I reluctantly climbed out of the vehicle, wishing with all my heart and soul that the ground would swallow me up whole. I really did not want to meet Dustin's grandmother, who had such a hold over his life. I could even feel eyes on me as I got out of the car, and it was a disquieting feeling. I absolutely knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Nora Trevelli was clandestinely watching me from one of the cabin windows. She was giving me the eyeful and wondering if I could ever be good enough for her grandson. Somehow I doubted that very much. The door was flung open at once, before we'd even made our way to the cabin, and Nora stood there with a warm smile on her face. But when she looked at me, her smile dissipated, and her eyes appeared cold and dark. "Oh, this must be, oh, what is the name again? Oh, yes, Clara," she said, putting out her hand to shake mine. Her grip on me was so hard, the squeeze so uncomfortable, I almost winced out in agonizing pain as I quickly retracted my hand. I could swear I picked up a satisfied smirk on Nora's face, as if she had delighted in hurting me. But I promptly told myself I was being absolutely ridiculous. The woman just had a hard handshake because she was very strong. Lots of people had hard handshakes, did they not? "It's so lovely to meet you, Clara," said Mrs. Trevelli. She eyed me up once again with her curious eyes. "Dustin's a very dark horse, isn't he? He's kept you a secret for long enough." Dustin chuckled. "Don't be like that, Granny. I didn't want to tell you anything about Clara until I knew exactly how I felt about her." "Well, you must be a very special person, dear," said Nora, "because you're the first girl that my grandson has actually brought home with him. Would you like to come into the dining room? Lunch is already laid out." I watched Nora Trevelli as she eagerly bustled around the lunch table, dishing up bowls of pasta and salad. "You're a very good cook, Mrs. Trevelli," I said, complimenting her. "This pasta tastes authentic. I mean, like real Italian." "That is because my cuisine is authentic Italian, dear. You see, when I was a teenager, I fell pregnant. My parents were desperately ashamed. Having a baby out of wedlock at such a young age back in the day was quite scandalous, you know. I was quickly sent to Italy to stay with my father's brother during the duration of my pregnancy. That was where I learned to cook Italian." "Wow, that's some story, Mrs. Trevelli. It certainly explains why you're an excellent cook." "Well, I considered that year, as it happens, the year that I was pregnant with my daughter Kendall, to be a very fruitful year. I learnt a great deal, you know. I learnt to speak fluent Italian and to cook like an Italian. But in those days it was such a shame being pregnant. So my mother ended up raising my daughter Kendall as her very own. And then my daughter fell pregnant as a teenager as well. She followed in my footsteps, would you believe it? That's why I've raised Dustin here. So you can appreciate, I care very passionately about his happiness." "Of course you do, Mrs. Trevelli. I can understand that." "Please call me Nora, dear." Why did I get this ominous, funny feeling that in Nora's words she was subtly warning me that she was passionate about her grandson, and that if I hurt him in any way, I would be answerable to her, and there was no telling what she was capable of doing. Was I reading too much into this, I wondered? She was indeed an attractive woman for her age, but there was a hardness to her that I didn't like one little bit. I did feel, even when she wasn't looking at me, that she was studying me through eyes in the back of her head, and they were very judgmental ones. I got a profound sense that no one would ever measure up for Dustin. It was not what she said to me that made me believe this. It was what she didn't say. The truth was that even though the light-hearted banter between us was friendly, Nora was a great attentive host, ensuring my plate was kept full with pasta and my wine-glass topped up with red wine. But there were unspoken words that drilled into me, that although were not audible, I could hear clearly in my mind's eye. "Get away from my grandson, if you know what's good for you," I heard in the silence. Once again I shrugged my shoulders. There was no way I'd heard that. Nora Trevelyan was being a great host. She asked me all about myself and my family. She wanted to know how me and Dustin had actually met. She did frown when Dustin revealed he'd caught sight of me in church, and when he heard that my father was looking for someone to help him with his horses, that he'd seen this as the perfect opportunity to get to know me better. That seemed to go down with Nora like a lead balloon. She raised her brow and put on what I can only describe as an insincere smile. She looked at me through her soulless dark eyes and said, "Goodness gracious me, my grandson really is a dark horse, isn't he?" I don't know how many times she actually said that. Dustin chuckled. "Well, I saw Clara in church, Granny, and I couldn't resist. I knew I had to find an industrious way to meet her, and meet her I did." "Good for you, son. So you cooked up a clever plan, did you? I'm very happy for the both of you coming together like this. If you make my grandson happy, Clara, how can I complain about that?" "Well, Dustin is great, and it's all thanks to you, Mrs. Trevelyan, I'm most sure. After all, you raised him. We connected from the very beginning. It was like we'd known each other forever." "Well, I'm very glad to hear that," said Nora. But her voice lacked that full-bodied enthusiasm. I was sure she was not very happy with me being in Dustin's life. It was a feeling that plagued me. When Dustin dropped me back to my parents' farm, I told him about my misgivings, which he waved off as me being paranoid. "You're being far too sensitive over this, Clara. I'm quite sure my grandmother loved you very much. If she asked you a lot of awkward questions, it was only because she was looking out for me. Isn't she allowed to be a little protective over her grandson? It might take her a while to warm up to you, but I'm quite sure she will come around. Granny Nora is a good woman. Yes, she's emotionally contained. Yes, she's reserved. But when she gets to know you, I'm sure she will love you, and you will love her in return." "I don't think so, Dustin. There's something about your grandmother I don't like." When I told my mother about the lunch I'd had at Nora Trevelyan's cabin, and how I felt that Nora disliked me, my mother assured me that, like Dustin, I had got that all wrong. "I think you're wrong about that, love. Don't forget I've met Nora Trevelyan at church myself. She's a lovely lady, you know. You must remember, love, she raised Dustin as her very own child for all these years. Then there you come along, like an unsuspected surprise that she never saw coming. It's bound to take her time to adjust. She's probably worried that you might hurt her grandson in some way. So she's naturally very protective of Dustin, and can you blame her for that? You yourself said that she's very cynical of romantic relationships, and that's understandable, because she's never been married, has she? I've got a great idea. Why don't you pop over and see her yourself? Bake some of your lemon drizzle cake for her. Tell her how much you like her grandson, and how you have no intention of hurting him. That might put her mind at ease. I rather think it will, you know. She's a very reasonable woman." "You think it will work?" I asked. "Well, you won't know, will you, unless you try, love. But maybe the poor woman needs some reassurance, and you can give it to her, can't you?" My mother's idea made an awful lot of sense to me. It took me 45 minutes on my bike to get to Mrs. Trevelyan's cabin, but I knew that Dustin was helping my dad with his horses, so that I would get Nora on her own. I hasten to say she was rather bewildered and taken aback to see me standing there on her doorstep, but she seemed genuinely pleased with the lemon drizzle cake I gave to her. "Goodness gracious me, dear! How did you know I love lemons? We Italians, we appreciate lemons. It's the most tangy kind of dessert for us. We have lemon in almost everything in Italy. What a thoughtful thing for you to do. I don't know what to say, but please do come in." "Mrs. Trevelli, it's Nora, dear," she reminded me. "Of course, so sorry, Nora. I came here today, to talk about Dustin with you. I knew he would be at my dad's farm, with your 2 Labradors at his side. I thought this would be the quintessential opportunity for us to have a talk together." "Do you like walking while you talk, my dear?" Mrs. Trevelli asked me. "I think a lovely walk in the woods might be well in order, don't you? There's a lovely trail I regularly take with the horses. It's open to the public, you see. We can ride there on Dustin's ATV, park it under the tree and take a walk through the woods. I was going to take a walk there myself, so it would be great if you came along with me. I usually go there on horseback, but the ATV will do just fine, and it's got 2 seats, you'll be pleased to know. I can pack up a bag for us with some homemade lemonade and some of your drizzle cake, and we can sit under the trees together to enjoy it. How do you fancy that? It's so much better eating out of doors, and we can lay down a rug under a tree and have a good old chinwag together. And it's such a beautiful day, is it not? It seems a pity to have our tea indoors. What do you say?" "It sounds absolutely lovely, Nora." I thought the idea of walking and talking was great, because I felt so ill at ease in Nora Trevelli's presence. So while we walked and talked, it would allay my anxiety and help me tell Nora what was on my mind. I needed her to know that I was not going to get my hands on her grandson like a praying mantis and spit him out. I intended to be in this relationship for keeps if I had my way in the matter. Nora Trevelli packed a bag with some goodies, while I went off to the bathroom to wash my hands. When I came back from the powder room, Nora and I climbed onto the ATV, which she parked outside the woods when we reached the public riding trail. We climbed off the ATV and began to casually stroll through the woods, and she was not wrong. It really was a prepossessing day. The sky was a cup of blue. The sunshine was gentle, offering a warm heat, while it spilled through the canopy of the trees and covered everything in a soft gossamer light. The earthen floor was richly fertile. Nora Trevelli packed a hearty bag with some goodies for us to enjoy while we were in the woods. I quickly went off to wash my hands in the powder room. When I returned, Nora guided me to the ATV, which she drove to the public hiking trail at a reasonable speed. It was a fun ride for the both of us, with the wind blowing in our hair. She parked outside the woods, and we casually meandered down the trail together, talking and laughing while we did. She was not wrong. It was a prepossessing day. The sky was a cup of blue. The sunshine was gentle, offering a warm heat, while it spilled generously through the canopy of the trees, covering everything in soft whispers of light. The earthen floor was richly fertile. Nora Trevelli was carrying a long bag over her shoulders, and she continued to talk to me. I was so glad I'd come to see her today. I was already seeing that all the awkwardness between us appeared to have dissolved. "I must admit, Clara, you gave me quite the surprise dropping in on me like this, but a very pleasant surprise, I might add. You said it was my grandson you wanted to talk about. Is that right?" "Well, I understand, Mrs. Trevelli. Sorry, Nora, from what you were telling me, that you and Dustin have become very close over the years, and I want you to really know that I do understand that." "We are incredibly close," agreed Nora. "I raised him from the day he was born, you know. Even his own mother, Kendall, sees him as a brother. I genuinely think she's forgotten that she ever gave birth to him, you know. And Dustin views me as a mother and a grandmother. It's been him and me against the world for all this time." "I can imagine. I know that you have a very special relationship with Dustin, and that he thinks the world of you." Oh dear, look, the footpath is getting rather narrow, isn't it? Said Nora. I tell you what, my dear, you go ahead of me. I'll walk behind you. What was it you were saying again? I didn't actually hear. I just want you to know, Nora, I said as I ascended the steep incline, well, that my intentions towards your grandson are honourable. I really like Dustin, Mrs. Trevelyan. Oh, I'm sorry, Nora. And I can promise you that I will never hurt him. Never. So you came here today to tell me that, is that right? Well, yes. I wanted you to know that I really like Dustin, I said, the colour rising in my cheeks. I would never mess with him. I can understand you're very protective, but I want you to know that. You understand absolutely nothing, dear, I heard Nora saying behind me. And then suddenly I felt something violently hitting the back of my head. The force was so hard, I nearly fell right backwards. I turned around to see Nora with a hammer in her hand. Her eyes were blazing. They were manic. She was glaring at me defiantly. You will go nowhere near my grandson, she said with a growl. I will make sure of that, Clara. You, my dear, are not going to get your filthy paws on him. You're nothing but a little harlot throwing yourself at my Dustin. I'll never let anyone come between the two of us. I've killed before, you know, and I will do it again to ensure the boundaries are never crossed. I cannot see what on earth he saw in a runt like you. Nora Trevelyan lunged forwards, with the hammer towards me again. I hurriedly backed out of the way. My head was booming violently from the first thump, from which blood was spilling down my face. I could taste the metallic taste in my mouth. Nora was grinning at me gormlessly, like some weird character you would see on a horror movie. She stared belligerently at the startled reaction on my face. I had not seen this coming. This woman was crazy. I needed to get away from her as fast as I could. But for some reason I just seemed incapable of moving away from her. I was so caught up in the shock of the moment that my body failed to catch up and to even respond, almost as if I was emotionally lagging behind. I was surprised I was still standing upright on my 2 feet, but everything was becoming rather wobbly and blurry. My mind was screaming to me, telling me to run away from this woman as fast as I could. Nora Trevelyan was a dangerous woman. She was intent on killing me. She had said as much, and I 100% believed her. My presence in her grandson's life had rattled her. She wanted me gone for good, and would go to any lengths and measures to ensure she disposed of me. I tried to run away, but I staggered around like an inebriated drunk. The blow to my head meant that everything around me was spinning. I tried to scream, call out for help, but nothing came out of my mouth. It was like I went completely mute. There was a murderous, vengeful look in Nora Trevelyan's eyes, as she came lunging towards me yet again, with the hammer raised in her hands. I closed my eyes, bracing for another beating on the head, when something very obscure came flying through the trees. It happened so very fast, I had no idea what was transpiring. I saw an obscure, dark, shadowy creature of approximately 8 foot tall, covered in hair. That was all I saw, a great big blob of black. But whatever it was, the creature appeared to pick up Nora in her overlong arms. Then she threw her up in the air as if she was all but a tennis ball. It was a Bigfoot that had come to my rescue. She was female. Nora came crashing to the ground and began to groan when she landed at the Bigfoot's feet. The Bigfoot walked over to her and then snapped her neck. That also happened so quickly. It was just so surreal. I stared confounded at the scene before me. I looked up at the female Bigfoot and heard a voice in my head. Sorry you had to witness that. I do apologize, but I'm afraid she needed to go. She meant to harm you, and I couldn't allow that to happen. It's not your time to go yet, but it is hers. Everything suddenly went very black. I believe I must have passed out. I woke up later to find myself on Nora Trevelyan's wraparound porch, lying across the sun lounger. I suspect the Bigfoot had brought me here. Dustin was shaking me and asking me what the hell I was doing at their cabin, and he wanted to know where his grandmother was. At first I was disorientated and confused, but finally I managed to come around from my delirium and get my bearings. Then I remembered everything that had happened, and how Nora Trevelyan had tried to kill me with a hammer. When I told Dustin the story about what had happened, he was naturally devastated to hear that his grandmother had tried to harm me. "I don't understand why she would do such a wicked thing. I had no idea she had a dark side to her character like this. What were you doing here at the cabin?" he asked. "Well, I could tell your grandmother was very protective over you. I made her some lemon drizzle cake, popped over to tell her I had no intentions of hurting you. She suggested we went for a walk in the woods together, and then, when she was walking behind me, she lunged behind my back and attacked me with a hammer." "I can't believe she did this," said Dustin, looking completely shell-shocked. "Why on earth would she hurt you? I thought I knew my grandmother well, but I obviously don't know her at all. I can't believe she's capable of such evil." "Wake up, Dustin. Smell the coffee. Your grandmother does not want anyone coming between you and her. She wants you all to herself, don't you see? And I impose a threat to her. She told me as much." "Bloody hell! I don't know what to say, Clara. I am so sorry that you had to go through all this. I had no idea my grandmother was capable of such evil. She is a monster. There is no other word to describe her. I knew she was protective over me, of course I did. I saw it as a compliment. But this idiosyncratic behaviour borders on the obsessive, and it's not remotely healthy." I thought that Dustin was going to think the Bigfoot part of my story was a mere fabrication, but he listened to me intently and believed my every word. He was mortified to learn the woman that he really loved so much would be capable of such outrageous behaviour. It was like his eyes had finally opened, and he suddenly realized the tight grip his grandmother had had over his life, and how she had not wanted anything to come between them, and would have happily disposed of me and anything else that would have got in her way. She didn't want anything coming between them, least of all me. I suspect she'd have happily disposed of me and buried me in the woods so that no one would know what had happened to me. I would just become another missing person statistic. Dustin insisted on getting me checked out by the doctor, who said I'd taken a rather bad banging to my head, but that I would be fine. It was when we both met up with my grandmother's best friend Kiki at Nora Trevelyan's funeral that she told us about the dark side of her best friend. Now, don't get me wrong, Dustin. I loved your grandmother Nora very much. Don't forget we grew up together, she told Dustin in earnest. But there was an insidious side to her character. I always knew deep in my gut that your grandmother had a very dangerous hold over your life, Dustin, and that one day she might do something quite dreadful, and it seems my fears were not unfounded. I was to learn later that the police believed that Nora Trevelyan had accidentally snapped her neck and fallen after chasing me around the woodgrove with a hammer. They also believed she'd killed Michael Drewbury, as she didn't want his interference in her life. It would seem the hammer she used on me matched the indentations of the hammer that she had used on Michael Drewbury's head. Our fears were later confirmed 5 years later, after I married Dustin and moved into the cabin. It was one day when I was cleaning out Nora Trevelyan's bedroom. I discovered, to my horror and disgust, a bottle containing 2 pickled eyeballs that were definitely human. I knew at once Nora Trevelyan had gouged out the eyes of Michael Drewbury with a surgical precision. She was clearly keeping the eyeballs as some kind of trophy. It was a horrifying thought to appreciate that had Nora Trevelyan managed to kill me, that my eyeballs might have also been gouged out and preserved in a pickle jar, as many narcissistic killers like to preserve such macabre mementos. I think the person that suffered the most from this ordeal was my husband Dustin, as despite everything he still adored his grandmother Nora, but seeing what she really was like underneath the layers of her saccharine sweetness had certainly thrown him a loop. Luckily, with plenty of counselling, he began to learn that none of this was his fault. and that his grandmother had an unfortunate illness that made her obsess over everything, like she had obsessed over her doll when she was 7 years old. So it would seem that against all the odds, a leopard never does change its spots. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.